Today, we're going to learn about a little boy in India who for a time seemed like he was the worst behaved kid on the planet. But the truth was, that little boy had a huge secret. And when his secret got out, it changed everything anyone thought they knew about this boy, and it prompted all these big-time college professors from major universities all around the world to personally fly to India to investigate this kid's claims, because the implications of what he was saying were massive. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's roll-on deodorant ball with a single clove of garlic. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late one afternoon in December of 1986, a woman named Shanti Singh was sitting on her bed cradling her toddler son, whose name was Titu, as he threw a huge temper tantrum. Titu, who was 3 years old, had already been throwing this tantrum for about 30 minutes at this point, and it didn't seem like anything Shanti did was getting him to calm down. In fact, honestly, it just seemed like Titu was getting worse and worse by the second. And Shanti knew her son's constant wailing must be annoying her neighbors in the little rural village in northern India where they lived. But again, Shanti just felt like really there was nothing she could do. After all, this was not a typical toddler tantrum. Titu was not throwing this tantrum because he lost a toy or was fighting with his siblings or something. No, the reality was Shanti and her husband had no idea why Titu was throwing this tantrum, because Titu threw these tantrums all the time for seemingly no reason, and nothing they did would get him to stop. He would just start throwing these crazy fits, and he would only stop when he was ready. Now, Shanti and her husband had taken Titu to the local doctor, and he'd been examined, and the doctor said, look, I think your son's just fine. I can't find anything wrong with him. So whatever's causing him to be so upset, it's got to be psychological. Shanti grabbed her son and tried to give him a hug and kiss to get him to calm down. But as she did that, Titu turned around and tried to hit her in the face and kicked her and punched her. And so Shanti had to kind of fall back on the bed. And Titu, at this point, who's still throwing this huge tantrum, he leapt off the bed and ran out of the room. Now, Shanti had already sent the rest of her family, her kids, her husband, outside to wait out this current Titu tantrum. And so for a second, Shanti thought about just laying on the bed and letting her crazy toddler just kind of run around the house until he was done throwing this tantrum. But as Shanti was laying there on the bed, practically crying from frustration, she heard a plate break in the kitchen. And so she jumped up and ran into the kitchen, and there was Titu looking down at the ground where there was a shattered plate on the ground. Clearly, Titu had smashed it on purpose. And so as furious as Shanti was, she suddenly realized that, nothing she could do was going to get this kid to stop. And so right now, the only thing she could do was just put him in a safe place where he couldn't hurt other people or himself or damage anything else. And so Shanti, trying to be as calm as possible, walked up to Titu, who's still throwing this tantrum and swinging at her as she's coming near him. And she grabbed him, she turned him around so he couldn't kick her or punch her. She put him into his room and then shut the door. And then she sat down in the hallway with her back up against the door to keep it shut. And then as Titu inside the room began banging on the door and trying to open it, Shanti's sitting there anchoring the door, and she's just praying that her son's gonna calm down soon. And then at some point, Shanti heard her son start to say something that typically signaled the end of a tantrum. Titu in the bedroom began saying the word Shirsh Verma, which actually was a nonsense word that Shanti and her husband and the other kids had no idea what it meant. But, Titu, at the end of his tantrums, he would always just start saying over and over again, Shirsh Verma, Shirsh Verma, Shirsh Verma. And so Shanti, she's in the hall and she's hearing Titu start to do that. And so on the one hand, she's thinking, okay, this tantrum's about to end. But on the other, she's like, I have no idea what that word means. It's obviously connected in some way to what's going on with my son, but I have no idea what it means. It sounds like nonsense. And so Shanti began yelling through the door at Titu to explain what Shirsh Verma meant, but Titu had no explanation. He just kept saying the word over and over again. Shirsh Verma, Shirsh Verma, Shirsh Verma. Shanti and her husband had 5 other kids. T2 was the youngest, and T2 was not like any of his other siblings. The other siblings did not throw temper tantrums like this, not at all. And in fact, T2 had been a difficult child even before he was born. Towards the end of Shanti's pregnancy with T2, she'd become very, very sick, and in fact had to be hospitalized for the entire last trimester. And then as a newborn baby, T2 basically didn't sleep at all, and he cried constantly, and so Shanti and her husband initially thought, T2 must just be a very fussy baby. But in time, as he grew into more of a toddler, it was clear to Shanti and her husband that T2 was actually a different kind of kid. He seemed like a very unhappy and kind of angry kid who was permanently on the verge of crying or throwing a fit. But it wasn't until T2 began talking at around 2 years old that Shanti and her husband really started to become worried. Because the things T2 was saying as a 2-year-old were just not in keeping with what you would expect a 2-year-old to say. And I'm not talking about the nonsense word that T2 would use during his temper tantrums, shurshverma. Basically, T2 would say things that seemed to indicate that he genuinely hated everyone in his family. Now, for context, Shanti and her family were not poor, but they weren't rich either. They lived in a little concrete home, they didn't have a TV or a car, and all the kids wore hand-me-down clothes, and Shanti actually handmade her clothes and her husband's clothes. But the family always had enough food to eat, and they were educated, and they seemed happy enough. It's just that they didn't really have the ability to do anything extra, like above and beyond a modest life. And T2 had never known anything different. This was his life from the day he was born. But when he learned to speak at around 2 years old, it was like all T2 wanted to talk about was how crappy of a lifestyle their family lived. For example, when T2's mom, Shanti, would put on one of her saris that happened to be ripped, a sari is a traditional garment in India, T2 would look at what she was wearing, and in toddler speak, he would tell her that she looked terrible and that it looked like she was just wearing rags. T2 would also walk around their house, and he would point to spots in the house that looked dirty, and he would demand that somebody cleaned it up because he didn't want to live in a dirty house. And then whenever the family needed to go somewhere and they would walk there or take the bus there, T2 would complain the entire time that he wanted to be in a car, and why aren't we driving in a car? Like, why are we walking? Despite the fact that T2 basically had never used a car before. But perhaps the strangest aspect of T2's behavior was around the time he began talking and insulting his family, he also began talking about this very historic city called Agra, which was located about 8 miles away from where they lived. Agra was famous for being home to the Taj Mahal, which is considered to be one of the most beautiful buildings ever made. Agra also has a very busy downtown and lots of tourism, but T2 had never been to Agra, and there was no reason he would be drawn to Agra, like his family had no connection to that city. But starting around the time T2 began talking at 2 years old, he began asking to go to Agra several times a week. And when his parents would say, no, we're not going to go to Agra, T2 would throw a huge tantrum. And so not long after T2 had begun speaking and saying all these terrible things, Shanti and her husband decided that really all they could do was just wait and hope their son grew out of this terrible behavior. But T2 did not grow out of this. Shortly after his parents decided to just kind of wait it out, T2 would randomly attack another small child with a sugar cane, and he beat the kid so badly the kid was bleeding at the end of the attack. And then also another time, shortly after the sugarcane beating, T2 was at the store with his mother, and his mom was looking at this bracelet, which she couldn't afford. She was just looking at it through the glass, and T2 sensed his mom wanted the bracelet, and in an odd show of affection for his mother, he turned to the shopkeeper, this little tiny kid who's not even 3 years old yet, and he tells the shopkeeper that if he doesn't give this bracelet to his mother for free, that T2 will shoot and kill the shopkeeper. And so after this, Shanti and her husband just stopped taking T2 out in public at all. It was just too embarrassing. But what really just unsettled Shanti the most about her son's behavior was that nonsense word that T2 kept saying at the end of all of his tantrums, shurshverma, shurshverma. And so fast forward to that day after he's broken the plate and now Shanti's put him in his room, T2 began saying that nonsense word, except he was getting a little bit older and his speech was getting a little bit more clear. And so as Shanti was laying up against the door, she realized that her son was not saying a single word, shurshverma, he was saying 2 words. They were Suresh Varma. But Shanti had no idea what that meant. She thought it sounded like a name, but it was a name she had never heard before. But one day, a few months after the dish-breaking incident, in April of 1987, all of T2's very strange, erratic, terrible behaviors would erupt all at once. That April day started out like any other. Shanti made breakfast for her family, and then her husband headed out to do some errands, and her 6 children kind of dispersed around the inside and outside of the house to play, study, whatever. But T2 was really grouchy, and so he stayed inside in the kitchen with Shanti. A little while later, Shanti's oldest son came into the kitchen and he asked his mother, "Hey, when will Dad get back from his trip to Agra?" Shanti's husband had gone to Agra to run one of his chores, and Agra was the city that T2 was totally obsessed with. And so when Shanti's oldest son said the word Agra, T2, who was sitting in the kitchen, he heard it and kind of looked up like he was totally fixated on their conversation. And then as Shanti and her oldest were talking about the dad, T2 just got up, left the kitchen, and he went to his room. He grabbed a couple of things, and then he came back into the kitchen carrying this bundle of clothes with him. And he walked right past his brother and his mother. He went out the front door and began running down the road without saying a word. Remember, this is like a 3-year-old child. This is not a teenager. This is a little kid. And so Shanti and her oldest son, they kind of watched in shock as T2 ran off down the road. And for a minute, neither of them did anything. And then it was like they broke out of their trance, and the oldest son just turned and began running out of the house to catch up with T2. Now, it didn't take long for the oldest to catch up with his young brother, but it was surprisingly hard to stop T2 from trying to run away. He fought back as hard as he could to keep his brother from pulling him back to the house. And then when the older brother got T2 back inside, Shanti looked at her older son and she saw he had a black eye from where T2 had just hit him. And when Shanti turned to T2 to try to get him to apologize to his brother for hitting him, she saw T2 was completely inconsolable. He was throwing a huge temper tantrum. He was on the ground kicking and flailing and screaming at the top of his lungs. And so Shanti and her oldest son knew there was no hope in getting him to calm down. He was deep into one of his tantrums. And so Shanti and the oldest just basically restrained T2 so he couldn't hurt himself or one of them or damage anything. And for a while, as they held him to the ground, T2 just continued to scream and flail and throw this fit. But eventually he did kind of calm down and he began saying Suresh Verma over and over again. But then he began talking about something that he really hadn't brought up before that stood out to Shanti and her oldest son. T2, in addition to saying periodically Suresh Verma, also began talking about some radio store in Agra. And T2 kept saying, "Why didn't Dad bring me to the radio store? Why didn't he bring me?" And so as Shanti is listening to her son, she suddenly thinks, you know what? This is my chance. He's being so specific about this radio store. Maybe this is my opportunity to lean in and learn what the heck is going on with my kid. And so once T2 fully stopped his temper tantrum and Shanti and her oldest could finally let go of him, once T2 had left the room, Shanti turned to her oldest son and she told him to go to Agra right now. Just go there and look for a radio store or something. Look for anything that could be a clue to what's going on with T2. He obviously has some fixation with the city. Just go, look around, see if you can find something. So the oldest son left the house and he went to one of his friends' houses who had a car, and together they drove into Agra. Now, Shanti had no idea if her oldest son's trip to Agra would produce anything useful, but she figured, she's got nothing to lose. A few hours later, when Shanti's oldest son returned from Agra, he came into their home with a very serious look on his face. And right away, Shanti could tell, clearly, he's discovered something. And so Shanti asked her oldest son, tell me, what did you learn? What happened in Agra? And the oldest son, he looked down for a second, and then he looked back at his mom and he just said, "Tomorrow, we're going to have visitors." Are you a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious? If so, then you're in luck. Because our massively popular show, the MrBallen's podcast, which since the end of 2022 has been exclusively on the Amazon Music platform, is now available on all podcast platforms, and it's free. There are over 200 episodes in the back catalog of this show. And of those 200, at least half of them have never been told on YouTube. They are only available on the podcast. And you can find those exclusive episodes by looking for the words podcast exclusive in the individual episode title. So again, the highly popular MrBallen's podcast is once again available on all podcast platforms, and it is free. To listen, just search for the MrBallen's podcast on Amazon Music or wherever else you get your podcasts, and then give the show a follow and then start your binge. Oh, and also, if you are one of the amazing people who subscribe to Amazon Music to follow the Mr. Ballin podcast when it went exclusive, don't give up your membership just yet, because there are still huge perks for listening to the show on Amazon Music. With your Prime membership, you can listen to new episodes of the Mr. Ballin podcast 30 days early and ad-free on Amazon Music. But again, the show is now available on all podcast platforms, and it really is free. So, thank you so much. Have a nice binge. The next day, a car pulled up in front of Shanti's home, and 6 people climbed out. There was a woman wearing a beautiful red sari who appeared to be in her 30s, and then there were 3 other men who also appeared to be in their 30s, and they were all wearing suits and jackets. And there was also an older couple, a man and a woman, and the man was wearing this beautiful sweater, and the woman had on all this silk. It was clear, just from the way they looked, that these 6 people were not from this area. They were from somewhere else, and they had a ton of money. Now, Shanti was inside the house, and she was watching this group arrive, but she did not go outside to greet them. She, her husband, and all of her kids, minus T2, had decided the night before, when they knew these visitors were going to arrive, that they wouldn't go out and talk to them. Instead, they would just allow T2 to basically make first contact with these people and see what happens. So when Shanti saw this group of 6 very well-off people were standing right outside of their gate, kind of waiting to be let in, she called for T2 and said, "Hey, go outside and open the gate for our guests." And so T2, who was not throwing a fit at this point, he came running through the house and he went to the door. He's not looked outside yet. He opens up the door and he runs outside and he sees these 6 people on the other side of the gate. And suddenly Shanti heard T2 make a sound that he never made. It was like the sound of pure joy. He was so elated to see these 6 people. Shanti couldn't believe it. For a second, Shanti closed her eyes and almost started crying, because she knew, even before T2 had made that joyous sound when he saw these people, they were about to solve the mystery of what was going on with her son. Just then, Shanti heard T2 from outside yelling for Shanti and the rest of his family to come outside and meet his other family. Shanti went to the door and gestured for the guests to come inside, and then she led them through the house to the back deck. And then after they were all seated, Shanti looked over at her son, T2, and she saw he had this huge grin on his face. He was so happy, and he was staring intently at the woman who got out of the car, who was in her 30s and wearing the beautiful red sari, and she was sitting right across the table from T2, and T2 is just locked on her. Now, at this point, nobody is speaking. Everybody is just sitting there. No introductions have been made, so nobody even knows each other's names. And in this kind of tense and awkward silence, T2, who again is just staring at this woman in red, he eventually breaks the silence, the 3-year-old child, and he asks the woman in red to come sit next to him. And so the woman in the red sari, she does what he asks and moves over and sits next to the toddler. And then T2 looked up at her and he smiled and he said, "Do you know who I am?" And the woman, she's looking down at him and she said, "No, I don't." And T2 would look back up at her and he would say, "I know who you are. You're Uma." And at this, the woman in red, whose name really was Uma, she gasped. She had no idea how this kid knew who she was. But before she could even say anything, T2 continued. And he said to her, "Hey, do you remember when we went to the fair with Ranu and Sanu and I bought you those sweets?" And at this, the woman in the red sari, Uma, she had this new look come over her face. Instead of looking like she was just kind of shocked and appalled that this random kid knew who she was, now it was like a look of shocked recognition as she's looking down at T2, like she suddenly understood what was actually going on. And at the same time, T2's mother, Shanti, was watching this happen, and she was kind of piecing together what was really going on here, and suddenly she realized she needed to check something. And she got up and she ran out of the room and she came back with scissors. And without saying anything, Shanti went straight to T2, she pushed his head to the side, exposing his right ear, and she used those scissors and began cutting all the hair off his head that was kind of drooped over his right ear, kind of exposing the right side of his skull. And as the hair on T2's head fell to the ground, exposing more and more of the right side of his head, all the adults watching just gasped. And the whole time, T2 was just smiling. To understand what just happened out on that back porch between these random people and Shanti and her family, you need some context. So here's what happened when Shanti's oldest son was sent to Agra to go investigate and look for clues that could explain what was going on with T2. The brother and his friend had driven all around Agra, looking for radio stores and looking for things that might in some way kind of connect to T2, and they didn't see anything. But at some point, they drove past one of the many radio stores in Agra, and the name of this radio store immediately stood out to the brother and this friend. So the older brother and the friend, they parked their car and they went into this particular radio shop, and inside of there is where they met Uma, the woman who had the red sari on, who was in her 30s, that T2 said we went to the fair together with, that woman. So she's inside this radio shop, and when the older brother asked Uma how this radio shop got its name, that was when things began to fall into place for this older brother about what was going on with T2. Uma would tell the older brother that this radio shop actually belonged to her husband, except 3.5 years ago, he was murdered. He was shot and killed, and so she had been running the shop ever since. And Uma said she had considered changing the name of the shop, since taking it over, but she just couldn't bring herself to change it because the shop's name was actually based on her husband's name. The name of the shop was Suresh Radio Shop. Her husband's name was Suresh Verma, the two words that T2 would say all the time at the end of his tantrums. Suresh Verma, Suresh Verma. That was Uma's husband. And it would turn out the details of Suresh's death matched up in a very bizarre way with T2's birth. And all of T2's totally erratic, strange, terrible behavior throughout really his entire life to this point now suddenly made sense if you knew about Suresh's life. Many people, including professors from major universities in India and America, have come to believe that what happened with T2 was when Suresh was murdered, his spirit somehow came out of his body and entered T2's body. Basically, Suresh was reincarnated in T2. This reincarnation theory would explain why T2 was always saying Suresh Verma, because in theory that was his real name. That's the guy who died, who then his spirit transitioned to T2, so he's saying his name over and over again. And then also T2's obsession with Agra would make sense, because that's where Suresh's radio shop was and where he lived. Also, the reincarnation theory would explain why T2 was so critical of Shanti and the rest of his family's lifestyle, basically accusing them of being poor and kind of living below his station. Well, Suresh's family was very, very wealthy, and so that was the lifestyle Suresh had lived. And so if his spirit was now in T2's body, he might be at odds with their lifestyle. And lastly, the reincarnation theory would explain the two very unique and very pronounced birthmarks that T2 had right next to his right ear. He had one right above his right ear and right below it. Now, these were birthmarks that Shanti was well aware of, but after she learned about how Suresh Verma was killed, he was shot in the side of his head, and the bullet went in above his right ear and then came out on the bottom part of his right ear, right here. When she heard that, she ran and got the scissors. She cut the hair away around T2's ear, revealing the two birthmarks. And then the other families saw those birthmarks, and they're like, oh my goodness, that is literally where the entry and exit wounds were on Suresh. And then also, it's worth pointing out that on the day Suresh was shot and killed, well, basically that day was when T2's mother, Shanti, began feeling really sick during her pregnancy with T2, and she had to be hospitalized. After this discovery about T2 and Suresh Verma, Shanti and her husband and the rest of her family expected T2 to want to live with Uma and his other family. And at first, that is what T2 wanted to do, but pretty quickly he actually decided that, you know what, I want to stay put with the family I was born into, and we can just visit with the other family. And so that's what they did. Uma and the other wealthy family, they made visits all the time to see T2 and vice versa. The families got along great. And as for T2, he was really happy. His bad behavior basically went away and he became a normal, high-functioning kid. And T2 has grown up and become a very happy and successful adult. He's got a family of his own, and he's currently a professor at a college in India. In the very early morning hours of December 26, 1980, Airman Steve Longaro was on a foot patrol at the Royal Air Force Base near Rendlesham Forest in the UK. And as Longaro walked along, suddenly this alarm sounded across the base. And based on the sound of this alarm, Longaro knew this was not a drill. And so instinctively he turned and began sprinting towards his assigned firing position right along the perimeter of the base. And as Longaro ran towards his position, he looked around him and he saw hundreds hundreds of other soldiers doing the exact same thing. But once Longaro actually reached his firing position and looked out, looking for the threat that's coming into the base, he realized he didn't see anything. But then when he turned to look at his colleagues to ask them, what's going on here, he noticed everybody else was not even looking outside the base. They were kind of looking off to the side towards Rendlesham Forest, because there was something out there kind of hovering in the trees that was casting this very eerie red light over everything. And this was just the beginning of what would go on to be one of the most credible and unsettling paranormal events in history. If you want to hear this absolutely crazy story, then you need to check out one of our newest podcasts out of Ballen's Studios. It's called the Bedtime Stories Podcast, and they're the ones that covered this story, and the name of this episode is the Rendlesham Forest Incident, and they just published it a couple of days ago. So look up the Bedtime Stories Podcast on any podcast platform, give them a follow, and then start listening. Enjoy. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast, where we have hundreds more stories a lot like this one. You can listen to the MrBallen's Podcast on Amazon Music or wherever you get your podcasts. Enjoy. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. Today, we have two stories about people who finally got to attend an event that they'd been working toward for years, but in both cases, actually going to these events would turn out to be the biggest mistakes of their lives. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to shovel the snow off the like button's driveway. But be sure to shovel the snow directly into their car. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Evidence. On the morning of November 18th, 2019, 54-year-old detective Muzi Mkhize stood in a long line waiting to get into a courthouse in Ikapa, South Africa. So Muzi was an investigator on a very violent robbery case that was finally being tried today, even though the robbery itself had happened almost 6 years earlier. Back in 2014, a group of armed men had stormed into a couple's farmhouse in Ikapa and brutally beat the couple before making off with a bunch of electronics and jewelry and weapons and other valuables. And so Muzi and his team had eventually caught and arrested these criminals, and in fact, they were even able to recover some of the items that had been stolen. In fact, now, Muzi had one of those stolen items with him to present as evidence at today's trial. Muzi had done this kind of court duty plenty of times in his career, but today, he felt really drained. On top of his trial prep for, this case, he'd also been working other active cases and also mentoring junior detectives. And Muzi was not young and energetic anymore. He was nearing retirement age, and all these obligations were really starting to take a toll on him. But the biggest thing that was really exhausting Muzi was this robbery case itself. It had been an extremely long process, full of an unusual number of delays and complications. It had actually taken so long to bring this to trial that the evidence Muzi was holding, like literally right now, had actually been returned to the victim couple so they could use it until the trial finally happened. So getting this case to this point had been extremely tiring, but Muzi and his team were determined to see it through no matter what. Because the criminals that did this, they were incredibly violent and genuinely needed to be behind bars to protect the public. They'd severely beaten this couple to the point where they were hospitalized, and it was lucky they hadn't been killed. As Muzi entered the courthouse and passed through the court security checkpoint, he hoped the security guards were appropriately on alert. In his experience, violent offenders, like the ones who were on trial today, often had violent friends, especially in Ikapa, where this kind of crime was unfortunately rampant. It wasn't unheard of for criminals or gang members to barge into court proceedings and retaliate against cops or prosecution. But Muzi was able to get through security. There was no suspicious people or any sort of disruptions of any kind. And so Muzi, once through, made his way into the courtroom. And he saw the space was already full. The defense and the jury and prosecutors and judge were all there, and there were members of the public in the gallery. Muzi went over and sat down at the prosecution table, and he would remain there until it was his turn to go up to the judge and present, which would include, showing this evidence. As Muzi got settled into his seat and, put the evidence down in his lap, he turned and sort of gave a quick wave to the prosecutor, a woman named Adelaide Ferreira-Watt, who was sitting at the table as well. She was going over her trial notes. Muzi had worked with Adelaide before, and they got along really well together. And she was a total pro, at least in Muzi's mind. So he knew that, her being on board meant this case had a really good chance of getting a conviction. Adelaide waved back at Muzi and then quickly got back to her notes. And Muzi took a look around the courtroom and everything seemed quiet and, again, there was no sign of any gang members or criminal friends charging in to cause problems. And, Muzi just hoped it would stay this way and that the trial would go smoothly and end the way he hoped it would. A few minutes later, and the judge sort of called the court to order and got the trial started, at which point Adelaide got up and began to present the case. And at this moment, despite the fact that Muzi had waited almost 6 years to get to this point, at this moment, when it finally was happening, he just felt this enormous wave of exhaustion sweep over him. He wasn't energized, it was sort of the opposite. It was like relief. And also, the room they were in was pretty hot, and, he was pretty tired, and before long, his eyelids got heavier and heavier, and eventually his head kind of slumped over to the side, and he dozed off. And at first, everything was fine. For a couple of minutes, Muzi just slept in the courtroom, and nobody even noticed or cared. Everything was okay. But then at some point, there was this sudden, very loud scraping sound. It was the sound of a bunch of chairs in the courtroom moving across the ground, and it was just very loud, and it woke Muzi up, but like really abruptly. He was startled by the sound, and when he woke up, like in his, sudden jolting awake, he dropped the evidence that he was supposed to be in charge of onto the ground. And so he's getting up, he's getting his bearings, realizing that it's kind of embarrassing. He was asleep. Did anybody see him? Like, what's going on? Everyone's moving around. He sees the evidence on the ground. So he goes under the table, he scoops the evidence back up. And as he's sitting back up, he hears this loud, like deafening bang echo through the courtroom. And he still really doesn't know what's going on. I mean, he just woke up. It's sort of chaotic in the room. And then he hears this scream coming from the side, sort of over to his right. And he turns and he realizes the scream came from the prosecutor, Adelaide. And so Muzi looks over the table and he sees Adelaide laying on the ground and she's clutching her hip. And her hip is now gushing blood. And so obviously she's been attacked. That loud banging sound he heard was almost certainly a gunshot or an explosion of some kind. And so Muzi immediately is thinking, clearly the friends or affiliates of these criminals on trial have stormed the courthouse and they've attacked us. They've attacked Adelaide. Are there more shooters here? Are there more attackers in the building? And so Muzi, who again, he's only woken up like 30 seconds ago, he's still sort of confused. He begins looking around the courthouse for, perpetrators, someone who's attacking, a gunman or something. But all he sees is just the chaos of people trying to flee the courthouse and others rushing up to Adelaide to try to render care. Like, there were no perpetrators, there were no gunmen, there was nothing. It was just chaos. And so for a second, Muzi is just sitting there, not really even sure what to do, almost like paralyzed by shock. And also, again, he's just woken up. He's sort of getting his bearings. And then he thinks of something. He's looking around the courthouse, this crazy scene. And he realizes that there is no gunman. There's no perpetrator. There's nobody. There's nothing. Which can only mean one thing. So to understand what happened inside of that courtroom, you first have to understand something about South African police procedure. And that is that in South Africa, as in most countries, after evidence is taken from the scene of a crime, it's examined and determined to be safe and then transferred to an exhibit room until it's time for trial. However, unlike in other parts of the world, in South Africa, there are exceptions to this procedure. And this trial had taken almost 6 years to start. And because of that huge time lag, some of the evidence that was recovered from the robbers' homes had actually been returned to the victim couple it was taken from, so they could just use it until the trial finally happened. The couple had returned that particular evidence to the police that morning, and Muzi had been charged with bringing that evidence to court and literally holding that evidence. But Muzi, when he did this, didn't double check to make sure this evidence was safe to be in a courtroom. And sometime after Muzi fell asleep in the courtroom, the judge had announced that it was time to take a break. And so the scraping of chairs that woke him up was the sound of people getting up to leave. But for Muzi, it startled him and he sat up really suddenly, what's going on? And he dropped this evidence onto the ground. And it would turn out this was like the worst thing that could have possibly happened, because this particular evidence was a shotgun. And when Muzi, sort of in his panicked, instinctive state, when he first woke up and he saw the evidence on the ground, he reached down to grab it, to pick it back up, because he was supposed to hold this thing for the whole trial and present it. The last thing he needed is people to see that he had fallen asleep and dropped it on the ground. But when he scooped it up, the gun, again, because it had not been re-examined, it would turn out it was still loaded. And so as he scooped it up, he accidentally hit the trigger and fired it, and it hit Adelaide, severed an artery, and killed her. But Muzi, was so confused by the chaos of the scene that at first, he didn't even realize he had fired the gun. He just scooped up the gun, heard the bang, and he's like, what's going on here? And it was when he realized there was no gunman that he looked down and he realized the shotgun was aimed right at Adelaide. He must have shot her. Muzi ultimately pled guilty to culpable homicide and negligence, and he was ordered to serve a 6-year prison sentence. However, it was suspended.
Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the west coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you got to act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballenstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all-expenses-paid-for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's going to be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. That is fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show.
On the morning of July 14th, 1912, a 21-year-old athlete named Francisco Lazaro stood in his hotel room in Stockholm, Sweden, getting dressed and ready for the day. And he was in Sweden to run the marathon in the Olympics. So a marathon is a race that covers exactly 26.2 miles. And for elite runners, it usually takes them between 2 and 3 hours to finish. Lazaro was representing Portugal, and this was actually a really big deal. This was his home country's very first Olympics, which meant Lazaro was one of only a few Portuguese athletes at the Games. And Lazaro believed that out of all of those people, all those other Portuguese athletes, he actually stood the best chance at bringing home an actual medal. So Lazaro had a chance to do something really historic for his country. And realistically, he wasn't even that nervous because he knew he was a truly elite, incredible runner. Even though he was just 21 years old, Lazaro had already won 3 huge marathons in Portugal. So he was already a star back home. But he knew that if he wanted to win on the world stage, he would need to come extremely prepared. So that's exactly what he'd done. He'd trained for months, obviously. He'd also recently gotten a medical exam to confirm that he was very healthy. And he'd even begun thinking about, little ways that he could potentially give himself a boost, like how to fuel, what to put in his body and even what to put on his body. I mean, even the smallest detail, like a shirt that wasn't breathable or eating something that kind of sat heavily in his stomach, could make the difference between winning or losing. Because again, this is like the world's best runners. Any little edge, he was going to take it. So now, Lazaro spent the next hour putting on the very specific clothes that he had selected for this race, and also eating a perfectly balanced light meal containing carbohydrates and protein, basically exactly what he had mapped out to help him in this race. He'd been warned that it was supposed to be very, very hot today on race day. But Lazaro actually saw this as an advantage, because being from Portugal, where it often got much hotter than places like Sweden, Lazaro already knew how to protect himself from the sun and the heat, and how to give himself an edge in this weather. And then before he knew it, Lazaro was ready to go, and he had left his hotel room, and he was on his way to the stadium to actually compete in the Olympics. A few hours later, today's story has a very distressing and graphic plot twist at the end, and so viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button you're going to upload on your YouTube channel 3, 4, even 5 times every week, and then knock it down to 3 or 4 times a week, and then 2 or 3 times a week, and then 1 or 2 times a week, and then go ahead and just don't post for 3 weeks straight. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Morgantown, West Virginia is this beautiful place nestled at the bottom of this huge mountain range called the Green Mountains. It is a big-time college town, as the famous West Virginia University is located there. And so during the school year, the town is full of young people, and during the football season, the town is absolutely buzzing with excitement. But the college is not the only reason people live in Morgantown. Lots of families choose to live there because there's so much to do year-round. Also, it's relatively safe, and in general, it's an up-and-coming place with new shops and restaurants and museums popping up every single year. But despite all of that, Morgantown is also known for something absolutely terrible, and that is the story of Skylar Neese. In 2012, 16-year-old Skylar Neese was a sophomore in high school in Morgantown, West Virginia. She was a straight-A student, and she worked part-time at a Wendy's, which is a fast food restaurant chain, and by all accounts, she was extremely well-liked by her peers, her co-workers, and had many, many friends. She was the only child of Mary and David Neese, and they absolutely adored her. David, in particular, who was this big, burly man's man, he said that he spoiled his daughter rotten. The parents would say their daughter was full of love and life, and she was fiercely loyal, and at times she could be absolutely hilarious. One of Dave's fondest memories is when Skylar was a very young girl, he was home taking care of her by himself. And that morning, as he's looking after her, she asks him if he will participate in one of her trademark tea parties. And so David, the ever-dutiful father, walks over and says, "Of course, I'll participate in your tea party." And he sits down in this little tiny pink chair, and his daughter, who's got her ballerina tutu on, she's across the table and she's all smiles, and she sits down in her little pink chair, and she hands him this little plastic teacup. And so he takes the teacup and he sees there's water already inside of it. And so he sips the tea inside of the cup and he says, "Oh, it's so good, honey. You did such a good job brewing this tea." And Skylar is just blushing. She is so happy and so thrilled that he liked her tea. Later that night, when Mary came home from work, she goes to her husband, Dave, and says, "Hey, how did it go? How was it looking after Skylar today?" And Dave would tell her about all the things they did, including their big tea party. And he would tell Mary that, this time she actually put water inside of the teacup, so it was actually like a real tea party. And Mary stops him and goes, "Dave, Skylar's not tall enough to reach the faucet. How could she have put water inside of those cups?" and it turned out Skylar was using toilet water to fill the teacups. Fast forward to 2012, and on the night of July 5th, 16-year-old Skylar Neese had just finished a night shift at the Wendy's restaurant, and she just got home. She walks through the front door of her family's apartment, and as soon as she gets inside, she tells her parents she's really tired, she wants to go to bed, and so she hugged both of her parents, she told them that she loved them, and then Mary and Dave watched their daughter walk down the first floor hallway, and then they watched her open her bedroom door, go inside, and shut it behind her. The following morning, Mary and Dave both had to work, so they were up early, and Skylar was not up. She was still in her bedroom, her door was still shut, and so they assumed she was just going to sleep in. And so Mary and Dave, they make breakfast, they're chatting, they're kind of doing their morning routine, and then when it was time to go to work, they decided, let's not bother Skylar. She worked late last night, let her sleep in. And so the parents, they leave without seeing or talking to their daughter. Later that afternoon, Dave would come home early from work, and he gets to the apartment, he goes inside, and it's quiet. Now, Mary was still at work, but Skylar at this point really should not have been asleep. It's like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And so he's thinking, she's got to be up around here somewhere. And so he yells out to his daughter, hey, I'm home. Where are you? What are you up to? But there was no response. It was just silent. And so he walked down the first floor hallway towards his daughter's bedroom, and he saw the door was still shut. Now, she only kept that door shut when she was sleeping. And so he's thinking, okay, I guess she must still be asleep. This is really late in the afternoon. So, I'm going to knock on the door and see if she's okay. And so he knocks on the door and says, hey, Sky, it's late in the afternoon. You got to get up. But there was no answer. And when he listened to the door, there was no noise coming from the bedroom. And so he thought that was pretty weird. And so he knocked a few more times. He yelled out a few more times. And when there was no response, no answer, no sound, he opened the door up. And when he looked inside, Skylar was not in there. Now, Dave was thinking to himself, I don't think my daughter told me that she would be gone today, or at least not right now. And he's trying to think, did she say something? Was she meeting someone today? And he couldn't think of it. And so he just pulled his phone out and he called his daughter, but she didn't pick up. So he called his wife, Mary, and Mary's at work, and Mary picks up, and Dave asks her, hey, have you seen Skylar, or do you know where she is right now? And she would say, no, I don't know where she is. Maybe she's out with one of her friends. And so after Dave hung up the phone with his wife, he wound up calling one of Skylar's very closest friends. Her name was Sheila, and she had known Skylar since they were in second grade. They were practically inseparable, and he had a good relationship with Sheila. And so he just calls Sheila, and he says, hey, I haven't seen Skylar. She's gone right now. Do you know where she is? And Sheila would say, no, I'm sorry, I don't, but I did talk to her last night, but, there was nothing unusual about our interaction. It was just normal texting about, normal stuff. And so Dave said, okay, thank you. Well, if you could, can you please try to get in touch with Skylar? And if you do get in touch with her, please tell her to get in touch with us. Or if you hear anything about her, please just let me know. After Dave hung up the phone with Sheila, he kind of stopped and just looked around his daughter's bedroom and thought, maybe there's some clue in here about where she's gone. And at first glance, really nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But when he walked around her bed and was looking inside of her closet, he saw the mesh screen that should have been mounted on the outside of her window was in her closet. And he's thinking, why is that in there? There's no reason for it to be in the closet. And so instinctively, he just turns around and walks over to the window that this screen is supposed to be on. And when he looks down at the bottom of the window, he sees it's open. Barely, just enough where you could maybe get your fingernails underneath the window and pry it open. And so Dave reaches down and opens this window all the way. And because there was no screen on this window, he just stuck his head all the way out the window. So his head is outside of the apartment. He's just kind of looking around, looking for some explanation of why this screen had been removed and put in her closet. And he got his explanation when he looked straight down and saw on the grass outside, just several feet below this window, because this is a first floor window, there was a bench, and the bench clearly had been moved there recently. For Dave, even though he had never heard of his daughter sneaking out of the house before and really didn't think that was something she would do, he's looking around thinking, okay, the evidence in her room and now outside of her room really indicates that that is exactly what she must have done the night before. She must have snuck out. But as he's processing this, he's also thinking, okay, well, if she snuck out of the house last night and then, snuck back into her room, why didn't she replace the screen on the window? And why didn't she close the window all the way? And then this morning, before she left to go wherever she went, why didn't she go outside and move the bench from under her window back to where it was supposed to go to avoid suspicion? Why didn't she do that? And then it dawns on him that his daughter must have snuck out the night before, but not come back yet. She's still out wherever she went. Dave was very concerned. However, he's thinking maybe there's a better explanation. Maybe I'm jumping to conclusions. Maybe she didn't sneak out. And so he calls his wife to kind of just talk with her and figure out what they should do. And they decide, you know what, this is concerning, but let's just give her a couple of hours to turn back up again. I'm sure she's fine. And so they begin to wait. And then at 4 p.m. that evening, Wendy's, the restaurant where Skylar worked, called Dave and said, hey, have you seen Skylar? She was supposed to work today and she didn't show up. She didn't call. It's very unlike her. What's going on? And this was the tipping point. Dave and Mary knew something had to be wrong, and so Dave called the police.
Long County 911, do you have an emergency?
I have a 16-year-old daughter who apparently snuck out of her room last night. She has not been home, hasn't went to work, can't get a hold of her from any of her friends. I am scared to death.
Has she done this before?
No.
After Dave got off the phone, he and his wife began kind of frantically figuring out what they should do. While the police are out looking, should we go out and look too? Or should we stay here in case she comes home and, maybe she's hurt. Maybe we can help her if she gets here. And so they're having this really difficult and stressful conversation when Mary's phone rings and it's Sheila. And so Mary immediately answers it, hoping for some good news about her daughter. But Sheila asks Mary right away, hey, has Skylar come home yet? And Mary says, no, she hasn't. And in fact, we just got off the phone with the police because this doesn't make sense. Something's wrong and we're getting the police involved. And so when Sheila hears this, she kind of takes a deep breath. And then after a little bit of a hesitation, she says, Mary, I've got to tell you the truth about last night. She would go on to explain that the night before, Skylar had snuck out of the house, and so had she, along with their other very close friend named Rachel. And Rachel was someone that Mary and Dave also knew very, very well. The three girls were kind of like best friends and totally inseparable. And so Sheila said the three of them snuck out, and in fact, they did this a lot, and they would drive around town and smoke marijuana together. But this was not the big reveal. Despite this being fairly shocking to Mary and Dave, this was not the big reveal. The big reveal was that when they went out and snuck out of their houses and smoked weed together, they would make sure they never drove their car. Whoever was driving would never drive directly in front of any of their houses because they were concerned that the noise from the car could wake up parents and then they'd get caught. And so the way they would do it is after they snuck out of their house, they would walk a block or two away from their house and then they would call or text the other two and they'd get picked up and they'd go do their thing. And then when they got dropped off, they would get dropped off a block or two away from their home and then walk the rest of the way. And so Sheila told Mary that last night, like so many other nights, she dropped Skylar off about a block away from their apartment. And then Sheila and Rachel drove off. So they did not actually see Skylar enter her apartment. So they don't know for sure if she actually made it home okay. And so this was obviously horrifying for Mary and Dave to hear because it totally opened the door for their daughter to have been abducted during this walk from the drop-off point back to her apartment. And the street she was on was not well lit. It's the middle of the night. It's dark. She's potentially high on marijuana. And so it seemed like that was a very realistic thing that could have happened, as horrifying as it sounded. And so after Mary got off the phone with Sheila, she called the police and she updated them about what Sheila had told her. And then Mary and Dave met up with Sheila and Sheila's mother and began searching the immediate area around their apartment in hopes that maybe, she fell somewhere and she's trapped and she just needs to be picked up or helped in some way. But after searching for several hours and knocking on dozens and dozens of doors, nobody saw anything, nobody knew anything, there was no sign of Skylar. And so as this group is totally down, they don't know what to do, they feel totally helpless, they know the police are out looking for Skylar, but they want to do something and they don't know what to do. And that's when Mary remembers there is a security camera on the outside of their apartment building that is looking down at the road. And so right away, the four of them literally run back to the apartment building. They go inside, they find the security manager, they explain the situation, and sure enough, he pulls up the footage from the night before. And the footage they see It doesn't make sense. Sheila had dropped Skylar off on that corner, kind of out of view of the camera, at around midnight. But at 12:30, so 30 minutes after she's been dropped off, you see this unknown kind of generic looking car pull up right in front of the apartment complex. And then Skylar comes running across the lawn, goes right up to the car, opens the back door, hops in the back seat, shuts it, and the car drives off. Even though this did not solve the mystery of where their daughter was, because they had no idea what car this was, who was driving it, or where they were going, Mary and Dave still felt relieved because from their perspective, it seemed like their daughter had willingly got into this vehicle. Whoever it was, whatever they were doing, she had gotten in on purpose, which meant she probably was not being abducted, which was their big fear. Over the next couple of days, the police analyzed this footage and tried to get information about this car, but the footage was so grainy, they couldn't do it. However, the police were telling Dave and Mary, hey guys, I'm sure Skylar is going to show up any day now. As much as you may not want to believe it, that your daughter is capable of running away, it is fairly common for teens to do that. They'll run away and then, a couple days later, they'll pop back up. And so I'm sure that's what's going on with Skylar. She chose to get in that car. And so I'm sure she will choose to get back in touch when she feels comfortable. So a couple of days go by and the parents haven't heard anything from their daughter. And then a couple of weeks go by, still nothing. And then a couple of months go by, still nothing. And this is all despite the fact that there is a massive search happening led by the police, and locals in Morgantown have put flyers up everywhere that have pictures of Skylar Neese's face everywhere in town and in neighboring towns. It was like you could not go 5 feet without being reminded that this girl is missing. Have you seen her? If you have, give us information. Despite the amount of publicity this case was getting, no one came forward with any meaningful information. It was like Skylar had just vanished and no one had a clue what happened to her. Her parents were obviously devastated that they had no idea what happened to her, but they were kind of holding on to this idea that, maybe she did run away and maybe she will eventually be in touch with us. But by December of that year, so 6 months after Skylar had gone missing, no one had heard from her, no one had seen her, no one had any idea where she was, there was no new leads. And so people were starting to feel less and less optimistic and the case was starting to kind of go cold. And then on December 12th, something totally unexpected happened that changed everything. On that night, Rachel, the other friend who had been there with Sheila and with Skylar on the night that Skylar had vanished, she has a full-blown nervous breakdown. In fact, it's so bad that she's screaming and running around and she's punching her family members, and her mom actually calls the police on her.
I have an issue with a 16-year-old daughter of mine. I can't control her anymore. She's screaming. She's running through the neighborhood. Give me the phone. No, this is over. This is over. Hurry up. She just gave me a block. Oh, God. Hurry up, please.
After this call was made, the police show up to Rachel's house and they take her away to a psychiatric hospital. And then several days later, when she was released from that hospital, she went straight to the Morgantown Police Department. She walked inside and said, I got to get something off my chest about Skylar. Apparently, whatever it was that she had been keeping secret had just been too difficult to keep inside. It was quite literally driving her crazy. And so the police said, okay, great. And they brought her into an interview room. They sat down and they said, okay, what do you got for us? The following has been pulled from what Rachel told police. Back on July 5th, 2012, Skylar came home from that night shift at Wendy's. She goes inside her family's apartment. She says goodnight to her mom and dad. She goes into her bedroom and she shuts the door, and she's laying on her bed. She's on her phone. She's not going to bed quite yet. And as she's laying there, she starts getting text messages from Rachel and also from Sheila asking her if she wants to sneak out that night. Now, Skylar didn't want to, and she said as much because she was actually hurting. She was mad at her two friends. According to some of her other friends that went to school with her and Rachel and Sheila, the three of them were totally inseparable, but lately, kind of the few months leading up to when she ultimately disappeared, there had been tension in their group. It seemed like Sheila and Rachel were getting very, very close and kind of pushing Skylar away, and Skylar was starting to pick up on it. It was little things like Sheila and Rachel would show up to school in matching outfits, but they wouldn't tell Skylar beforehand, kind of leaving her out. Or whenever they posted selfies of the three of them, Skylar was always relegated to the back or kind of in some other way obscured to make sure she was not the focal point of the picture. It was just very obvious that they were deprioritizing Skylar, and it was really hurting Skylar's feelings. And so it seemed like her way of standing up to them and kind of telling them that she was upset was to turn down their offer of sneaking out and smoking weed with them. But over the next couple of hours, Skylar would eventually say, okay, fine, I'll come with you guys, I'll sneak out and we'll go smoke together. Just before 12:30 a.m. on July 6th, Skylar gets off of her bed, she walks over to her window, she lifts it up, and she pulls the screen off, and she walks over to her closet, she puts the screen in her closet and shuts the door to the closet, and then she walks back over to the window and crawls out and lowers herself down onto the grass below, and then she walks over and grabs the bench and slides it over and puts it right underneath her window, and then she stands on the bench and reaches up and pulls the window down so there's just a little crack left so she can get back inside. And then she just waited by the side of the apartment looking out towards the road, and right after 12:30, this car, the unknown car on the surveillance camera, pulls right in front of the apartment building, and Skylar runs over to it, opens up the back right door, and climbs inside. This unknown car was Sheila's car. Sheila was driving, and Rachel was in the front passenger seat. It would turn out Rachel and Sheila lied about basically everything, including what time they picked up Skylar. So the three girls, they drive away from Skylar's apartment, and Sheila hops on a highway and starts driving northwest. Now, the girls did not immediately start smoking inside of the car. They decided instead they would actually drive to a location, get out, and smoke there. And the place they decided on was a spot they had smoked at before. It was a known hangout spot for teenagers. It was located about 45 minutes away, just barely across the border into Pennsylvania. It was down this kind of old country road that nobody ever went on. And so Sheila drives the car 45 minutes. She crosses into Pennsylvania. She finds the turn onto this old road. They drive down it a little ways until they're pretty far away from the highway, at which point Sheila pulls off the road onto the grass, parks the car. The three girls get out, and they walk past the car a little ways down the path to a clearing on the right. There was a hill that went up on the right, and they would kind of sit on this hill looking downhill, and that would be where they would smoke. And so the three girls, they sit down, they're all next to each other, facing downhill. They're not facing each other. And Sheila, who was sitting all the way to the right with the car being over to the left, she pulls out the marijuana joint, and she's about to light it, but she realizes she does not have a lighter. And so she asks Rachel and Skylar if they have a lighter, and they both pat themselves down. They're checking themselves. They don't have a lighter. And then Sheila says to Skylar, who's all the way to the left of the way they're sitting, so Skylar is closest to the car, she asks Skylar, hey, can you go in the car and get the lighter that I know is in there? And Skylar said, no problem. So Skylar, she stands up and she turns. Her back is to her two friends. And as soon as she starts walking, what she would have heard is the sound of her two friends standing up as well, and then loudly saying, 1, 2, 3. And on 3, Skylar would have felt two knives being plunged into her back by Rachel and by Sheila. In a panic, Skylar does not even turn around. She just starts taking off running towards the car, and she manages to run away from her attackers. But because of her grievous injuries in her back, she eventually slows down, at which point Sheila tackles her from behind. She gets her on the ground, she pins her on her back, and Sheila is trying to stab Skylar, but Skylar is doing her best to keep the knife off of her. But at some point, Rachel comes running up beside them, and between Rachel and Sheila, they manage to hold Skylar's hands down, at which point Sheila and Rachel began taking turns stabbing her in the chest and in the neck. The whole time, Skylar is trying to defend herself, but it's impossible with these two on top of her. And at some point, she just kind of gives up and she says, why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this to me? But they don't give her a reason. They just keep on going. And eventually, Rachel stops stabbing Skylar, but Sheila doesn't. Sheila keeps on going until, quote, her neck stopped making gurgling sounds. And then once Skylar went still, Sheila stood up like it was nothing, and she and Rachel just walked away from her body, back to the car. They went around to the trunk of the car, they opened it up, and inside was shovels, bleach, trash bags, rags. They had brought along a kill kit because they knew what they were going to do this night. And so they start by cleaning themselves off. They get the blood off of them and off of their weapons. And then they take the shovels and they walk a little ways off of the road, kind of into the woods, and they try to dig a grave, but it would turn out the ground was too hard. And so they abandoned the grave idea and just grabbed Skylar's lifeless body and drag it just about 6 feet off of the road and kind of chuck it against a log. And then they threw boulders and sticks and anything they could on top of her body. They don't know if she's still alive at this point, so they're potentially dealing the fatal blow with these rocks and logs. They cover her up until she's totally obscured. And then the two girls just walk back up. They grab their shovels, they grab their rags, their bleach, they put it back in the trunk, they hop in their car, and they drive away. It would turn out Rachel and Sheila had been planning this for months. The reason? They didn't like Skylar anymore, and apparently it wasn't enough to just be mean to her and not include her in things. They actually needed to kill her. And so the entire night that they went out and snuck out, that was all planned. They knew Skylar did not want to come out and sneak out with them because they knew she was upset with them. And so they said whatever they had to say to convince her to leave her house and sneak out with them. And so she did. She snuck out. And when she got in that car, Sheila and Rachel had their knives already in their front pocket of their sweatshirt, ready to go. And on their ride to this spot in Pennsylvania, Sheila and Rachel acted like, oh, let's just go to this spot and smoke. When in reality, this was planned too. They wanted to make sure they were far away from Morgantown when they killed Skylar. And so when they got there and they walked down to their spot to actually begin smoking, Sheila and Rachel had intentionally not brought lighters, and Sheila had left a lighter in the car specifically so she could ask Skylar to go get it. Because the plan was, as soon as Skylar gets up to get that lighter and her back is to us, Sheila and Rachel had promised each other that they would count to 3 and then attack her. Ultimately, Rachel would be sentenced to 30 years in prison, but she'll be eligible for parole in 2023. And Sheila would be sentenced to life in prison, but she would also be eligible for parole in 2028. During their trials, Rachel was very remorseful and even gave an apology to Skylar's parents during the sentencing phase. Sheila, on the other hand, smirked during her trial for most of the time. She was smiling and totally making light of it. She said she didn't do it. She was totally not remorseful, and she did not offer an apology to Skylar's parents. She did, however, leave an unbelievably cruel message on Twitter. In March of 2013, when the police came out and officially said, we have identified the remains in the forest in Pennsylvania as belonging to Skylar Neese, when that announcement was made, just a couple of days later, Sheila tweeted, we really did go on 3. Sheila was arrested 1 month later. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please tell the like button. You're going to upload 3, 4, even 5 times a week on your YouTube channel, and then drop it down to 2 or 3 times a week, and then 1 or 2 times a week, and then abruptly just go absent for 3 weeks straight. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username is the same for both platforms. It's just Mr. Ballen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is also Mr. Ballen. We also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen's Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called Mr. Ballen, where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. One night, 4 young brothers were sleeping in their bedroom in their little house in Tennessee when they started to hear what sounded like a rat gnawing on one of their bedposts. So the 2 oldest brothers climbed out of their bed to go find this rat, but the second their feet touched the wooden floor, the gnawing sound stopped. The boys checked the room, they checked the bedposts, there was no sign of any rat, and so eventually the 2 oldest brothers just kind of shrugged it off and got back in bed. But when they closed their eyes again, the gnawing sound filled the room again, except this time it was louder and more frantic. Little did they know, these sounds were just the beginning of a multi-year-long nightmare that they and the rest of their family would have to endure. Their terrifying story is known as the Bell Witch haunting, and it is considered to be one of the most frightening documented hauntings of all time. And today, I'm going to share their story with you. But before we get into the Bell Witch haunting, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please ungold the like button's goldfish crackers. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In 1804, a man named John Bell decided his farm in North Carolina was just too small for his growing family. So he, along with his wife Lucy and their 6 kids, packed all their belongings onto wagons and then traveled more than 600 miles west to this 1,000-acre patch along the Red River in northern Tennessee. The area they settled was known as Robertson County, and at the time, it was very rural and basically nobody lived there. And so the Bell family, when they arrived in Robertson County, fully expected to have to work with the few families that were there to build up the settlement. Basically, they wanted to build a town from scratch. But this was the kind of work that John Bell was born for. He was raised on a farm where he had a reputation for working extremely hard and never giving up. John was very generous and excellent at working with other people. In fact, when his family was still in North Carolina, John and his very gentle and sweet wife Lucy would open their door to anybody who needed a place to stay or a hot meal, and sometimes John would just give money to his neighbors when he felt like they were down on hard times. So, after arriving in Robertson County and after the Bell family had met their few neighbors, John Bell got right to work. First, he began clearing trees off of his land, and then with that lumber, he built a 1.5-story log house up on this hill not far from the Red River. And in fact, the Red River was a very popular picnic spot and fishing spot for the few people that lived in Robertson County, and so in virtue of the Bell's house being so near the river, the Bell family was always running into their neighbors and saying hi and making friends. And so it wasn't long after John and his family had arrived and built this house that the Bell family became one of the most popular families in the area. And for many years, the Bell family lived a very happy and prosperous life in Robertson County. Most mornings, John would wake up first, and then he would rouse the children, who would then leave the house and walk through the nearby woods to go to their school, and then they'd come back before sunset, and then while the kids were at school during the day, John and his older sons would go out and work the land or help build structures around town to build the settlement up, or they would build the boats that they would use to transport the tobacco and meats they produced on their farm down south for trade. John and Lucy would have 3 more kids while in Robertson County, and before long, their oldest children began getting married and starting families of their own and building their own houses nearby. But one summer day in 1817, so 13 years after the Bell family first arrived in Robertson County, John would have a very strange experience that at the time he would completely write off. But years later, they would look back and say, that's when it started. On that summer day in 1817, John was by himself. He was out walking through his cornfield near his house when he looked out and he saw this big dog just sitting in the middle of the cornfield. Now, there were lots of dogs around Robertson County, so it wasn't unusual to run into a dog while you were out and about. But there was something off about this dog. It almost looked misshapen, like its bones had broken many times over and reset at awkward angles. And this dog just looked way too big to be a dog. It almost looked more like a big wolf. And this dog was staring at John in a very human way, not breaking eye contact, staring right at John. Now, John was not someone who easily spooked. But standing in this cornfield, staring at this dog who was staring right back at him, John couldn't help but feel totally unsettled and a little bit panicked. And so John, who had his rifle with him, raised it and fired in the direction of this dog. And when he did, the dog took off running. And so John, he watched as this dog galloped away from him and disappeared into the tree line of the forest far away. And once the dog was totally out of view, John marched forward to the spot in the cornfield where this dog had been sitting. And when he got there, he was expecting to see the corn kind of pressed down from where this big animal had been sitting, but it wasn't. There was no sign that any big creature had been sitting right there. And as he looked around him, he saw there were no paw prints, no tracks on the ground, either coming to this spot or going in the direction that he watched this big dog run off. John was totally confused by this, but after sitting there kind of wondering how this could be, he just told himself, you know what, I'm overthinking this. It was just some big ugly dog and a missed shot. This is no big deal. And so John promptly turned around and walked back to his house, forgetting all about the dog. But not long after John saw this dog in the cornfield, his family began experiencing other strange things back at their house. At night, after the Bell family had climbed into bed, they would start hearing a knocking sound on the side of their house. And as soon as they got up to go inspect it, the knocking would stop. And then they'd lay back down again and they would hear it again, except it was coming from another side of the house. It was like there was someone or something outside of their house just kind of circling around them, periodically knocking on their walls. Now, John was convinced this was not the work of some animal. This was a person, a prankster, and they were hiding out in the woods somewhere. And so he instructed his family not to mention the tapping sounds to anybody in town because he thought somebody in town was doing this to them and he didn't want them to know that they were onto them. He wanted these pranksters to come back and do it again so he could catch them in the act. But over the course of several weeks, the tapping continued, and every time John would lay in wait and try to run out and see who was there, there'd be no one. And there'd be no tracks anywhere around the house indicating that anyone had ever been there. And as unsettling as these knocking sounds were for the family, they were nothing compared to the things that happened next. My pet frog, Seagull Lung, is a huge fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, and so for his birthday, which was last week, he asked me if I would take him on a special camping trip where all we did was sat around the fire and I just told crazy stories. And so of course I said, "Sure, Lung, I can do that for ya." And then, on his big day, old Lungy came bounding down the stairs all excited for his big camping trip. And I stopped him and I said, "Hold on a minute, Lung. Forget the camping trip. I got something even better for your birthday." And then from behind my back, I presented a gift fit for the gods. Homemade fermented Norwegian lemming liver cakes with a side of koala stew. Now I know what you're thinking. Wow. Lungy must have been so happy. But no, he wasn't. Turns out my gift was gross and way worse than a strange, dark, and mysterious themed camping trip. But there was a silver lining to this minor birthday snafu. After Lungy refused to eat my beautiful gift, I went online to try to figure out what Lungy would eat. And so I typed into Google, "Who has the best food in the world?" And 2 words popped up that changed my life. Hello Fresh. With HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit, you can skip the grocery store and take control of your time and budget with delicious food delivered right to your door. With over 35 weekly recipes, they have the options you're looking for to help you achieve your New Year goals. Choose Calorie Smart or Carb Smart recipes, or even customize select meals by swapping proteins or sides, or upgrading your proteins, or adding a protein to a veggie dish. And with HelloFresh, you always get top quality. Their ingredients come from the farm to you in 7 days, so you literally are eating fresh. HelloFresh. So, if you're like me and you keep gifting your loved ones terrible exotic food dishes for their birthday, then you need to sign up for HelloFresh today. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen21 for 21 free meals and free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen21 for 21 free meals and free shipping. Okay, back to the story. One Sunday night in May of 1818, so roughly 1 year after John had seen that big dog in the cornfield, and a couple of months after the knocking on the walls had begun in the Bell's household, 4 of John's sons were asleep in their bedroom inside of their home when they woke up to the sound of what sounded like a rat gnawing on one of their bedposts. Now, these boys were sleeping in 2 bunk beds, and the 2 oldest brothers were sleeping on the lower bunk. And so they instinctively got up, stepped onto the floor to go find this rat, but the second they stepped onto the floor, the gnawing sound completely disappeared. The 2 boys searched the room for this rat, they couldn't find it, and when they checked all of the bedposts, there was no sign that any of them had been gnawed on. So the 2 older brothers finally just kind of shrugged it off and climbed back in bed. The moment they closed their eyes, the gnawing sound began again. Except now it was louder and more frantic, like whatever was under there was desperately trying to chew through the wood of their beds. But again, when the 2 older brothers leapt out of their bed to go find whatever animal was doing this, the sound would completely stop and the room would go still. The boys searched the room again. There was no sign of any rat or any animal. There were no marks on the underside of their beds. And so they had no idea what to make of this. The gnawing sounds would continue all that night, making it nearly impossible for these boys to sleep, and it would happen again the next night the same way. But on the night after that, so the 3rd night, the boys heard a new sound in their room. As they're laying in their beds, exhausted from barely sleeping the last 2 nights, they began hearing what sounded like someone gasping for air underneath their beds. Like they were being choked, they were gulping and smacking their lips and clawing at the underside of the beds. The 2 oldest boys were terrified, but eventually worked up the courage and leapt from their bed to confront whatever was underneath them. But again, as soon as their feet hit the floor, the sounds completely stopped and the room went still. But this time, the boys were so frightened, they decided not to try to just go back to sleep. Instead, they woke up the rest of their family, and the Bell family searched the entire house, top to bottom, looking for any indication of what could have been making those sounds. But there was nothing in their house. There was no marks from some animal or rat. I mean, there was no indication that anything was other than normal. Now, to this point, the Bell family had not told anybody in town about either the knocking sounds on the walls, or the rat gnawing sounds, or now the gulping for air sounds. And a part of that was because John had told the family, don't tell anyone because we're going to catch whoever's doing this. But another part of it was the family knew as soon as they brought this stuff up, they could be the target of ridicule because people wouldn't believe them. But after this night, with the gulping and gasping sounds, the Bell kids really could not sleep anymore. They were just up all night, terrified. And so finally, John went to one of his neighbors who he was very close with and confided in him that something weird was happening inside of his house. Now, John was not the kind of person who made things up. He was very straightforward, very honest. He didn't even tell jokes. And so this neighbor, as he's listening to this unbelievable story, just takes John at face value and says, you know what? I'll stay the night in your house and I'll see if I can hear all these strange sounds. That night, the neighbor would stay with John Bell and his family in the Bell household. And sure enough, the neighbor would hear the tapping on the walls, he would hear the rat gnawing on the wood post in the boys' room, as well as that gasping and gulping sound coming from the boys' room. And this neighbor was so terrified that he did not last the night in John's house. He left in the middle of the night to go back to his house. After this, word spread quickly around Robertson County about what was happening at the Bell household, and the way the townspeople reacted was very supportive. I mean, the Bell family had been instrumental in building up the settlement, and John and his wife Lucy were so kind and generous, and so the townspeople decided that they were going to find a way to rally around the Bell family and try to help them. So other people in town began volunteering to spend the night inside of the Bell household with the Bell family. One, because they wanted the Bell family to feel some security, having some more people around them. And two, these people were thinking that maybe just their presence inside of the Bell household would scare off whoever or whatever was tormenting the Bells. But no matter who stayed inside of the Bell household, the noises persisted every single night. Townspeople came up with all sorts of explanations for what was happening to the Bell family, ranging from, John's youngest daughter must be behind this because she wants attention, or other people said maybe there's a family or an individual that hates the Bell family and they're targeting them and they're behind this. There was even a theory that someone in town had learned ventriloquism, which is a kind of performance where the ventriloquist throws their voice so it sounds like it's coming from somewhere else, not from from their body. And so the idea was this ventriloquist was just a prankster and they were screwing with the Bell family. But the townspeople searched the Bell's house with the Bell family over and over again, and they never found any sign of what could be making these noises. The people in town even went so far as to have people watch each member of the Bell family as they slept at night to make sure none of them were responsible for these sounds. And sure enough, as the Bell family was being closely monitored, the noises would start, and it was very clearly not coming from anyone in the Bell family. As the months went on, and the Bell family was forced to endure whatever was going on inside of their home, the people in town started to notice something odd about John Bell. Normally, John was a very engaged person, that when he spoke to you, he was locked onto you and really paying attention. But at some point, after these mysterious things began happening at his house, John would be talking to someone, and then suddenly his eyes would kind of gloss over and his jaw would go slack, and it would look like he was staring off into the distance. And then his face would start to twitch. And at first, these twitches were fairly minor and were centered just around his eyes. But over time, these twitches became much more dramatic, to the point where his jaw would start to kind of quiver up and down, and his eyes would begin blinking out of sync. And then when the twitching finally stopped, John, without saying a word to the person he had just been talking to, would just wander back to his house. He'd go up to his bedroom, and he would sit on his bed for hours and hours and hours, just staring at the wall, not eating, not drinking, not saying anything. The Bell family felt like they were hostages in their own home. They had no idea what was causing these things to happen or why they were happening, and they were all filled with this constant sense of dread. As for the townspeople, most of them had come to believe that whatever was happening to the Bell family was likely caused by their neighbor, Kate Batts. Kate was known to be very eccentric and kind of unpleasant, and she was known to be fairly unlucky because her husband had become disabled and her 3 kids had all died young. Kate also had this strange habit of using really big, complex words in her conversations, but she misused the words, and so everything she said kind of sounded off. Townspeople would talk about Kate Batts' witch, and they started referring to whatever was causing these strange phenomenon at the Bell household as just Kate. However, when Kate found out about this, she was totally offended and said she had nothing to do with whatever was happening to the Bells. By September of 1820, the terrifying happenings at the Bell household had been going on for 3 years, and somehow the Bell family had just learned to live with it. However, John Bell was not doing good. It was like the longer these strange things were happening, the more and more John seemed to become a shell of his former self. His sudden dazes and twitching fits began to happen more and more frequently, and the time he would spend afterwards sitting in his bedroom staring at the wall in silence would go on longer and longer and longer. In private, John would tell his wife, Lucy, that he believed someone or something was torturing him to death. And then one day, as John was getting sicker and sicker, one of his daughters, Esther, left the house to go gather up some eggs in the hen house, which was across the lane from where the Bell house was. And so she left the house, she crossed over the road, she began walking up towards this hen house, and as she was walking, she heard what sounded like someone moving behind her. And so she turned around and she saw there was this woman dressed all in black with her head down, walking slowly down the road she had just walked on towards her house. So she's basically walking exactly where Esther had just come from, but Esther had not seen her until just now. So she wasn't really sure how this woman had arrived on the road, but Esther wasn't worried. She looked at this woman, she didn't recognize her, but just assumed she was somebody from town, and that was it. And so Esther turned away from this woman and walked the rest of the way up to the hen house. She went inside, she got the eggs in her basket, and then when she came back outside again and she was back on that road, now facing in the direction of her house, she saw this woman in black with her head down was still trudging along slowly, now much closer to the Bell household. And so Esther, she began walking down the road looking at this woman, trying to figure out who she was, and as she got closer and closer, she realized she recognized her as somebody from the village. This was a neighbor of hers. And so Esther yelled out a friendly hello. But this woman in black with her head down didn't turn around, she didn't react, she just kept on slowly walking down the lane towards the Bell house. And so Esther began walking a little bit faster, getting closer and closer to this woman, and she yelled out a few more times, "Hey, hello, how are you?" But each time, this woman in black just appeared not to hear Esther. And Esther, she's looking around, and there's nobody else out. It's just her and this woman who's now about 15 feet away from her. And so Esther starts to feel really uncomfortable about this woman. And so Esther just stops on the road and stares at the back of this woman. And the second Esther stopped, this woman who was trudging along also suddenly stopped. And then she reached up with her hands, her back is still to Esther, and she took her bonnet off of her head. A bonnet is a type of hat. And then she dropped the bonnet on the ground, and right away this woman's black matted hair kind of tumbled down over her back. And then this woman, without moving, began reaching up and stroking her hair, running her fingers through her hair as if she was trying to comb it out. And so Esther is watching this, kind of wondering what's going on here. And so Esther began walking slowly closer and closer to this woman to make sure she was okay. But with each step that Esther took towards this woman began running her hands faster and faster through her hair until it almost looked impossible. She was moving so fast. And then Esther realized with horror that she wasn't just combing her hair. This woman was grabbing clumps of her hair and pulling them out of her head. In fact, Esther could literally hear the hair being ripped from this woman's scalp. And so before long, there was hair all over the ground around this woman. And so Esther at this point is terrified. She thinks there's something wrong with this woman. And so she runs around this woman without looking at her, charges into her house, which is right in front of this lady. She goes inside, she locks the door behind her. And then Esther calls out for one of her sisters who was home and said, "Come here, come here." And the two of them went to the front window and they look out onto the road and they see the woman. She's still there in the same spot, ripping her hair out. But Esther makes eye contact with this woman. And the second that happens, the woman freezes. Her hands are still in her hair and she's looking directly up at Esther. And Esther and her sister, they're kind of taken aback by the way this woman is looking at them. And then this woman slowly brings her hands down and she's staring up at Esther the whole time. And then she turns suddenly and walks around the side of the property out of view of Esther and her sister. And so Esther and her sister, they shriek, they leave the front window and they run over to the side window where this woman was heading. And they saw this woman climbing up and over their fence, getting into their side property. And behind her were now 3 children who they had not seen before, just marching right behind this woman in black. And so this woman and these 3 children, in plain sight of Esther and her sister, they walk into this grove of trees on the Bell property. And so Esther and her sister, they're just staring. They have no idea what's happening. And then one by one, the woman first, then each of the children climbed their own trees. And then once all 4 of them were up in these trees, they turned around so they were all looking directly at Esther and her sister. And then they all began swaying with their bodies in the trees, getting these trees to bend and wave hard left and right. And so Esther and her sister are horrified. And as they're staring, Esther's husband just happens to come through the front door. And so Esther yells for him to come over here and look out the window. Look what they're doing out there. And so Esther's husband, he runs over to the window and he looks out, but he can't see the woman or the 3 kids. He can only see trees swaying unnaturally left and right. And so Esther and her sister, they realize he's not seeing what we're seeing, what's happening. And before long, they're screaming. The husband's trying to figure out what's going on. And finally, the trio just ran from the window, went out the back door, and ran around to the side yard to go confront this woman and these children. But when they got out to the grove of trees, the woman, the kids, they were gone, and there was no tracks anywhere on the ground to indicate that anybody had been there recently. Not long after this incident, sometime in October of 1820, John Bell and one of his sons were out for a walk on their farm. And as they walked, suddenly John stopped and threw his hands up to his face as if he was protecting himself from someone trying to hit him. And then all of a sudden, John's face just went totally slack and his body began to contort into these horrible, grotesque angles, and his back began to arch so far it looked like his back would break. And so John's son, he's watching this happen. He has no idea what to do. And so he just runs over and grabs his dad and tries to pull him upright. And as he does this horrifying shriek fills the air. John's son has no idea where it's coming from, but it's so loud it stops him in his tracks. And then as fast as all of this had happened, it all stopped. John was back to normal, laying on the ground, coming to, and the shrieking was gone. It was silent on their farm. And so John's son turns to his dad, and he sees John is crying on the ground. And he says to his son, "I don't have much time left." John's son would help him up, and then the two of them silently just walked back to the house, and John went straight to bed. A few weeks later, on the morning of December 19th, 1820, John didn't come down for breakfast, and so his family went up to his bedroom to make sure he was okay. But when they found him, he was still laying in bed, he was breathing, but no matter what they did, they couldn't wake him up. And so one of John's sons ran to the medicine cabinet inside of their house, but when he opened it up, all the medicine was gone, and in their place was this strange glass vial that contained a smoky, dark liquid that the son had never seen before and no one in the family had seen before. And so the family immediately called for a doctor to come to their house, both for John and also to see what this liquid was. And so the doctor showed up. He didn't really know what to do for John. It didn't make sense that he just was not waking up. And then the doctor checked on this liquid and he said, "You need to test this on some farm animals to make sure we know what it does." And so the family went out and found a stray cat and they force-fed it some of this liquid, and within minutes, the cat had died. The Bell family swore they had not put that vial in the medicine cabinet. They had no idea what it was or how it got there. As for John, he would not wake up that day, and in fact, the following morning, when he was still in bed, he died. After John's death, the strange occurrences at the Bell household basically all came to a stop, for the most part. Some people in town reported, after John's death, seeing strange lights floating around the Bell property, and also sometimes they reported hearing a strange sing-song voice kind of coming from somewhere out around their property. John's wife, Lucy, would remain inside of that house until 1838, when she passed away. Today, there's nothing left of the Bell household. However, there is a cave on their property, an underground cave, and people swear that's where whatever tormented the Bells came from. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ungold the like button's goldfish crackers. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we put up the remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We post near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So, whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. There is a subgenre of detective fiction that deals with locked room mysteries, which are about crimes that are seemingly impossible to commit. The standard example being a murder victim found inside of a room that was locked from the inside. Today, we're going to look at a real-life locked room mystery that took almost a decade to solve. And when the truth finally came out, nobody believed it. It literally sounded like fiction. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's Cocoa Puffs with similarly shaped dog food. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. On August 22nd, 1922, shots rang out from inside a stately Victorian home in Beverly Hills where Dolly and Fred Ostrich lived. Neighbors called police right away, and when officers stepped into the front door, they saw the entire house was trashed. On the floor in the living room was Fred, who had been shot to death, and next to him were 3 .25 caliber shell casings. With weapons drawn, the police cleared the entire first floor. There was no one down there. They heard screaming coming from upstairs, and so they run up the stairs, and they get up there, and no one's upstairs. And then they heard the screaming again, and they realized it was coming from inside of a closet in the master bedroom. And so as the police are clearing the second floor, they yell out to this woman and they say, "Who are you? What are you doing in the closet?" And she yells back, "I'm Dolly. I'm okay, but I'm trapped." And so after the police finish clearing the upstairs and they're sure it's safe, they go over to the closet door and they do try the handle. It's locked. They ask her, "Do you know where the key is?" And she says no. And so before they start trying to break the door down, they did a quick search of the upstairs to see if maybe they could find the key to the closet. And sure enough, across the hall in another bedroom, they found it on the ground. And so they took the key back, they opened the door up, and out came Dolly. She was okay, but obviously very frantic and panicked. And they asked her, what happened? And she told them a very abrupt and chaotic story. She said she had been hanging clothes inside of this big walk-in closet, and her back was to the door when she heard a fight break out on the first floor. And before she could even turn around to go investigate, she said the closet door was swinging shut, and then she heard it lock from the outside, and she didn't get to see who it was that shut the door. The whole thing was a bit of a head scratcher for police, because they're thinking, okay, well, was it one person that attacked Fred downstairs and then ran upstairs and shut and locked the door immediately afterwards before Dolly could come out and see? Or was there 2 people, one person downstairs attacking and one person upstairs shutting and locking the door? Or was it more than 2 people? And despite the house being totally ransacked and there being lots of valuable stuff in their house, Dolly said the only thing she could tell was missing was the diamond-encrusted wristwatch that Fred always wore. It was not on his wrist when they discovered his body. And why, detectives wondered, were these burglars or this burglar carrying a .25 caliber weapon? Something that small was more likely to be found in a woman's purse than in a home invasion. When police spoke to neighbors, they were quick to say Fred and Dolly fought all the time, and earlier that night they had gotten into a really bad one. But as much as police wanted to point the finger at Dolly, it was just impossible for her to have committed this crime, because how could she have murdered Fred and then ran upstairs and locked herself in the closet from the outside and then also somehow deposited that key across the hall in another room? It just didn't make any sense. But since the police had little else to go on, they dug into the new widow's past. Dolly was born in Germany in 1880, and following a move to Milwaukee, Wisconsin just before the turn of the century, she married Fred, who was 3 years older than her. Fred was driven and successful, but he was also a raging alcoholic and prone to violence. And so as Fred built up his textile empire, opening up factory after factory all across the Midwest, their marriage grew strained. He was mean and she was lonely. When they moved from Milwaukee to Southern California in 1918, their new neighbors immediately were aware of the fact that Dolly and Fred fought loudly and often, and they frequently bickered in public. Police looked high and low to see if Dolly had maybe taken a lover, but no one had ever seen her with anyone but Fred. And so while they might be miserable, they seemed to be faithful. And so try as they might, the police could find no clues that suggested anything darker or more dangerous than a petty and meaningless marriage. The case hung open, and suspicion continued to trail Dolly, even though it was physically impossible for her to have committed the crime. Now free from her unhappy marriage, Dolly moved into a new home in Los Angeles, and she took up with her estate lawyer, Herman Shapiro, who was handling her husband's $1 million estate. But just like her late husband, her new boyfriend, Shapiro, worked long hours, and he was not around much, so she was lonely all over again. So she went out and got another boyfriend, a guy by the name of Roy Klum, and she began seeing the men at the same time. A year after Fred's death, Captain Herman Klein of the Beverly Hills Police Department dropped by Dolly's estate lawyer/boyfriend's office. Detectives were still suspicious of Dolly, even though the case still made no sense. And so Captain Klein goes into Shapiro's office, and wouldn't you know it, sitting on the desk is this beautiful diamond-encrusted wristwatch that looks an awful lot like the watch Dolly claimed was the one thing stolen from her house on the night of her husband's murder. When the captain asked Shapiro how he got this watch, Shapiro told him that Dolly had given it to him as a gift But I know where you're going with this because I thought the same thing too. I know about the missing diamond watch on the night of the murder. I asked Dolly about it when she gave it to me, and she told me that that was actually a mistake. The watch was never missing, and she later on found it tucked underneath a sofa cushion in the living room. The captain was not buying this, and so as soon as he left Shapiro's office, he immediately confronted Dolly about the watch, and Dolly said, you know what, that's right. I did find the watch, but I didn't think it was that important, so I didn't tell you guys. The captain couldn't believe what he was hearing. And shortly after, the newspapers found out about this new twist in this totally bizarre case, and they went wild with it, putting all the heat back on Dolly. Spooked by the headlines, Dolly's second boyfriend, Roy Klum, came forward to the police and said, I have a confession to make. Dolly made me hide one of her .25 caliber pistols, and I threw it in the La Brea tar pits. And then before police could even go get that gun, one of Dolly's neighbors came forward and said, yeah, I got a confession to make. Dolly asked me to get rid of a .25 caliber pistol, and I buried it in my backyard. So police went out and recovered both weapons, but they were so badly rusted, they couldn't confirm if they were in fact the murder weapons. And Dolly had an excuse. When the police confronted her with these guns, she said, oh yeah, those old things, I've had those in the house for years, but given the circumstances of my husband's death, just felt a little awkward keeping them around the house, so I had some friends get rid of them. The police were not buying this, and so in July of 1923, they arrested Dolly for killing Fred. But despite these new developments, the facts of the case had not changed. It was still physically impossible for Dolly to have committed this crime. She was locked in the closet from the outside. And so with Dolly in jail awaiting trial, investigators tirelessly hacked into her story to try to find holes in it, but they had no success. And so after every theory that might connect her to the crime was ultimately discarded, they had to drop the murder charges and Dolly was released. 7 years went by and the crime was largely forgotten about. And then in 1930, Dolly and her estate lawyer boyfriend Shapiro, they broke up. And Shapiro immediately called the police and said, you know what? I haven't been entirely truthful. I know a lot more about what happened to Fred than I've let on, and in fact, I have someone in the office with me right now that can tell you the whole story. Investigators flew to Shapiro's office, they go through the doors, and sitting inside is a man they never knew existed. His name was Otto Sandhuber. He was a quiet, small sewing machine repairman / aspiring dime store fiction writer. And the story he would tell them would be more bizarre and lurid than any investigator could have imagined. It began almost a decade before the murder. When Otto was a teenager, he had worked for Fred in one of his Milwaukee factories. One day in 1913, Dolly complained to Fred that her sewing machine was broken. And so Fred asked one of his employees, who he knew was a sewing machine repairman, the then 17-year-old Otto, if he would go over to his house and fix the sewing machine for his wife. Dolly knew her husband was going to send Otto specifically to their house, and she was very attracted to Otto. And so when Otto showed up, all she had on was a silk robe, stockings, and heavy perfume. Thus began Dolly and Otto's affair, which at first they conducted in a pretty typical way, meeting secretly in hotels, but when that became burdensome, they moved their relationship back into the ostrich home, with Otto needing to sneak in and out around Fred's schedule. But it wasn't long before nosy neighbors were asking Dolly, who's that strange man coming around your house all the time? And she would say, oh, that's my vagabond half-brother. But Dolly and Otto knew they couldn't continue in this way. But instead of breaking it off or returning to secret hotel liaisons, Dolly decided that Otto should take up residence in the ostrich home in a secret hideaway in the attic. That way no one would see him coming or going. Otto, who had no family to miss him, quit his job at the factory, moved into the secret room, and then never left. Pretty quickly, Otto and Dolly fell into a routine where when Fred would leave for work for the day, Otto would come downstairs, they'd spend time together, and then Otto would clean the house and then make bathtub gin. Before Fred came home, Otto would sneak back upstairs to write pulp stories about lust and adventure, and he would read newspapers and magazines by candlelight. Around this time, Fred started complaining to Dolly about strange noises in the house. He also started to notice they were running through food a lot faster than normal, and a couple times he thought he was short a cigar. But no matter how much Fred complained, Dolly was always able to convince him that everything he was hearing and seeing was in his head. And so over the next 5 years, they would live in 4 homes in Milwaukee, and always these strange sounds and oddities about the house would follow them, but Fred never investigated. In 1918, Fred told Dolly he wanted to move to Southern California, and so Dolly hunted down a house with an attic, a rarity in the area, and she sent Otto ahead. When Fred and Dolly arrived, Otto was already ensconced in the attic, and Fred moved in right beneath him. By the time Fred and Dolly got in their final argument on the night of August 22nd, 1922, Otto had been secretly living with them for almost a decade. On that deadly night, Otto was in his secret room listening to drunk Fred getting louder and angrier and clearly getting physical with Dolly. And so worried that he might kill his lover, Otto leapt out of the attic and ran downstairs carrying two .25 caliber pistols. He runs into the living room and he confronts Fred. And Fred is astounded to see his formerly teenage sewing machine repairman, who abruptly quit the factory so suddenly and completely, now standing in his living room. And so Fred lunged at Otto, and Otto just started shooting. It was then that Dolly hatched the scheme that had almost let them get away with it. Knowing the police would be there any minute, Dolly staged the house to look like a robbery. She told Otto to lock her inside of the closet and then ordered him to go back up into the attic. And so when the police got there, Otto was crouched silently right above their heads. After the killing, Otto moved in with Dolly in her new house, and even though they could have had a normal open relationship, Dolly ordered Otto to go live in the attic of this new house as well. It wasn't until a year later, when Dolly was briefly arrested after the police found out about the hidden guns, that Otto was forced to come out of the attic. While Dolly was sitting in jail for these gun charges, she begged her estate lawyer boyfriend, Shapiro, to go get groceries for her vagabond half-brother, Otto, who lived in her attic. She said, when you delivered them, make sure you go to the bedroom and knock on the ceiling. That will let him know it's safe to come out. But when Shapiro arrived and followed the procedure and Otto came out, Otto was so starved for human interaction and conversation that he wound up telling Shapiro the whole insane story. But instead of going to police, Shapiro told Otto that he should just leave. And he did. He went and became a janitor and he got married. The secret held until Dolly and Shapiro broke up for good, at which point Shapiro called the police. Dolly and Otto were arrested and the press went insane. They called this the Batman case because Otto was living like a bat in a cave. This was before Batman the comic was a thing. Otto was convicted of manslaughter, but the statute of limitations was up, so he was allowed to walk free. As for Dolly, she was allowed to walk free too because the jury hung on her conspiracy to commit murder charges. After the trial, Otto disappeared and nothing more is known about him. As for Dolly, she stayed in LA and she died in 1961 at the age of 80, 2 weeks after marrying yet again. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's Cocoa Puffs with similarly shaped dog food. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. So today we have a very special and very unique episode for you guys. So if you don't remember, last year on October 20th, 2023, I did my first ever live show to a real audience, 1,300 people at the Paramount Theater in Austin, Texas. I was absolutely terrified before I went on stage, but my goodness, it was like one of the best experiences of my life. And if you were there, thank you for being there. You're amazing. It was such an amazing time. I'm so glad I got to meet so many of you. But critically, we were actually filming a documentary right around this time about me becoming Mr. Ballen. And it was about basically my journey from, the TikTok days to YouTube and podcasting. And then we kind of capped off the documentary by including footage from this live show. And so right now, we're going to premiere that documentary that we're so proud of. Only a handful of people have seen this, and so this is a big deal. This is a really cool thing. We hope you enjoy it. But also, stick around till the end of this documentary because we have quite possibly the biggest announcement ever out of the strange, dark, and mysterious universe. It's the biggest one yet. I think you're going to be really excited about it. And hint, hint, it's alluded to throughout the documentary what the announcement is going to be. But before we get into this amazing documentary and big announcement at the end, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, on the hottest day of the year, offer to give the like button a ride to work. And when they get in your car, blast the heat on full and refuse to stop. Even though it hurts you, it hurts them too. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into the world premiere of the documentary Becoming Mr. Ballin'. Enjoy. Hi, my name is John Allen. I am better known as Mr. Ballin' online, and I would say that I am a professional storyteller.
Your ability to storytell is impeccable. Some of the stories that you pick are just like it screws with my mind a little bit.
All their tents had been slashed open, but from the inside, and inside the tents was all their gear.
You are the channel that I binge, told my mom about, she binges it. Told my brother about, he binges it.
My comfort zone, yeah, literally being in a storytelling mode.
Well, future you, I hope the show went incredibly well. I hope that you got to enjoy being on stage and got to really just be in the moment. I'm very nervous, but I'm very excited. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
I grew up in a town called Quincy, Massachusetts. It's just south of Boston, Massachusetts. My mother and my father were both and are still just brilliant people. My father is, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He ran an investigative journalism team at the Boston Globe called Spotlight. My immediate family, the way we communicated was like, we'd send these emails to each other that were like totally unnecessarily long about like really kind of meaningless things. Everybody over communicated. Everyone had to write in beautiful prose and like tell whole full-length stories about the smallest of things. And so I was literally raised effectively by storytellers. I always viewed myself as being kind of like the black sheep of my family because my two sisters, my older and younger sister, like totally excelled in school, and my older sister became a Pulitzer Prize winner twice actually, and my younger sister is a PhD scientist working out of a Harvard lab. I was like the guy that kind of bombed high school. Not because I was dumb, I just didn't really try. Effectively flunked out my first semester in college because I didn't go to class. But fast forward a bit, after I did wind up graduating college, I got my act together. I joined the Navy and I become a Navy SEAL. And one of the things people don't know about really the military, unless you're in the military, is there is lots and lots of public speaking that goes on all the time. I learned that my strength was definitely like, I can tell stories exceptionally well, and I can remember a lot of details if I have a story in my mind. There wasn't ever a day where I thought to myself, here's the big idea. Generally speaking, social media and, creating content allows people, kind of relative nobodies, to post things on the internet, and if the world likes it, it can elevate that person and create, a brand or, a new YouTube channel. I really missed the mark for a number of years trying to create content that people would like. I mimicked other people's content style on TikTok, which was so cringy. I was like doing dance videos and like comedy sketches. Nobody was interested. But I knew the one thing that I've always been just fundamentally interested in is strange, dark, and mysterious content. I
put together this really crappy TikTok video. Crappy in the sense that I formatted it all wrong. Like the script didn't really make much sense, but it had the meat and potatoes of this really fascinating story about these hikers that go missing in the 1950s in Russia.
When you finish this video, you're going to Google 2 words. In 1959, 9 very experienced Russian hikers set off on a 16-day expedition into the mountains. 7 days in and some bad weather forced them to...
And I post this story to TikTok, and I was actually at a water park with my family in Pennsylvania. Because we're going to be in the water park, I couldn't have my phone, it would get soaked, so I left it in the room. We went to the park all day, and I came back to my room, and I opened up my phone. The video that I had posted about the missing hikers had like 5 million views. And to give some perspective, I think the most views I ever got on any piece of content ever to that point was like maybe 10 or 20,000 over like a year-long period. I launched into this insane, making content 24/7 to try to replicate the success of that first video. After a few months of doing that, and the TikTok account had really grown quickly, I transitioned to YouTube. I remember I pulled my wife aside, Amanda, and I tried to explain to her, like, hey, so I have this thing going on TikTok, and I'm gonna like do it on YouTube. I don't know what it's gonna be, but I think it's something. But in order for me to do it, I need you to take the kids basically 24/7 and let me only work like 24/7 until this becomes whatever it becomes. And my wife's like, okay, I'll do that for you.
So I wanted to bring you into my dojo where I create all of my content. It's called the Mustard Room. It's pretty high speed, so don't be intimidated. It's my setup. It's nice and neat. This is where all the magic happens.
I kid you not, I was in that back room in Pennsylvania with the space heater and the rodents in the walls, like churning out content for like 6 months. And I was sleeping in there. I mean, literally, it was my life. She believed in me, and so she let me do it. And it really is what allowed the channel to grow.
John was flagged to me by my buddy Giacomo. So Giacomo's the guy that hit me up. He's like, if anyone can work for this guy, it's you. And I knew nothing of digital. I knew nothing of YouTube, nothing of TikTok. I don't even have social media. I didn't understand what I was looking at when I looked at John's content. But me being a veteran, and I've always worked with veterans in entertainment, I was like, I like what he's doing. I can believe in this guy and what his message is. And I could tell that there was something there. So I was like, all right, let me, have you guys tried to sign him? They're like, yeah, we tried to sign him like 8 months. He won't sign with us. He barely take a call. He's a former Navy SEAL, makes content from his phone. What's a manager to this guy? I go, you guys are just approaching it wrong. I reached out to him. I got his email, subject line, I'm a combat vet, love your material. I work with Mr. Beast. I also have some experience in the traditional space, and I love your content, huge fan. Hit me up if you ever have any questions. Not here to sign you, not here to make any money, just one vet to another. About a week later, he hit me up. He's like, dude, I was running through some emails, deleting everything, and I saw your email, and I'm down to talk. It was funny because these guys who like rep Mr. Beast couldn't sign this guy, and so for me, I was like, if I'm gonna work with anybody, this is the guy.
Not everyone gets to find their unicorn, but I did in Nick, and I think Nick found his unicorn in me, and that's what it has allowed us to grow, where I know what I'm responsible for, and it's the thing I know I'm good at, storytelling, and Nick does everything else.
You can't just insert yourself in someone's life. You have to just show, that you're there for the right reason. My way was like, all right, I lived in Austin, he was in PA, but I put a reminder on my calendar every Sunday. Ping John, say what up, and just ask him if he needs any help with anything, and just start to kind of build a relationship organically.
I mean, Nick really, single-handedly has grown from me, the one-man band, MrBallen's, to a full-blown studio. I've been in the back room of my house in Pennsylvania that had no heat and rodents running in the walls, to now have a literal studio with all the right equipment and soundproofing.
This is the podcast setup. It's about half of the studio here. And the most important part of the podcast setup is right here. Boom. Got the headlights, the functioning headlights on the set. Very cool. I bring this guy down here. And boom, this is the podcast setup. And if we're doing a live event, you'd see the cool headlights. But I always turn them on no matter what. And over here, we have the YouTube setup. As you can see with the green screen here, this actually took so many coats of paint. This is like not a simple thing to create. It needs to be totally uniform. So sick little green screen, and then the MrBallen's director's chair. Sit here. Fire up my my laptop, and then I record YouTube episodes right here. And believe it or not, even though I have this whole studio, I still record the YouTube episodes on my phone. And so I literally just put my phone on this little $5 tripod, sit down here, and if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do inside of the strange, dark, and mysterious studio. And so this is it. This is where I spend like all my time. I do my research and writing and scripting over here, and obviously YouTube as well. And this is it.
I really don't read from the script. It's not because I'm better than that or something. It's more like the way I work, the way I tell stories is I need to like inhabit the story and really like internalize the details of the story. And so I get the script and I study the script and basically memorize not the words on the page, but the structure of the story. And then once it's in my head, like I've got it. I wanted to make it really clear to anybody that was going to tune in and watch a piece of content from me. If you wait to the end of the story, it will be worth it. Every week we're putting out multiple stories that are, 7,000 words, which is 30 to 45 minutes long, that are fully researched, and written out. There's an enormous amount of work, and this is how many YouTubers begin. They just kind of do it all themselves, but it's totally not sustainable. I have this mantra that I try to preach to my kids, which is like, do things that scare you, because generally speaking, things that scare you are actually the things you want to do. I'm so impressed with people that literally take the stage and perform in front of a live audience. To me, like stand-up comics are some of the bravest people you'll ever meet. That is an otherworldly level of courage to go up there and face potential ridicule and like bombing. I'll admit that I was still resistant to the idea, even though now I have the material and I have the audience that would listen to it, but I was still just like nervous. I want the people in the audience to be drawn into the stories I'm telling the same way they are at home when they're watching YouTube or listening to a podcast. And it's a privilege to have the opportunity to stand in front of people that want to be there. 1,000+ people who have chosen to be here, that have flown from out of the United States to be here just to listen to me. Like, yes, that's pressure, but it's also a privilege.
Wow. Taking it all in. Hello, team. How you doing? Wow. Very strange, dark, and mysterious in here. This is amazing. Whoever designed and did this. Amazing. I don't know what I had in mind, but it was way less cool than this. This is infinitely better than I imagined.
This is my daughter, Mr. Ballen's. She loves you. We're here because of you. We flew all the way from North Carolina.
We love your show. You're doing great, and thank you for serving our country.
Excited to be here. Can't wait to see you. For years, I've been watching all of your videos. I got my husband to watch all of them as we go to bed. They have become our bedtime routine, so thank you, Mr. Ballen, for everything that you've done for us.
John's fans are like the strongest, most loyal community I've ever seen. And the fact that he gets to bring that to them in person is just fascinating.
Rare shot of a hatless, in uniform MrBallen.
Yeah.
Very cool. I'm actually feeling pretty calm.
Oh yeah.
All things considered.
Yep, wanted to make sure you had a good feel of like when you're on stage, what they're gonna see, how you're gonna see them. You probably won't see too deep in.
I probably will see virtually no one.
Nobody. Yeah. Imagine everyone naked. That's the trick. He's so primed. He's such a professional. And he's been ready for this since he started telling stories. He just now is at a point to really execute it. To look at this, and I'm just like so proud for like him, my client, but I'm so proud of him as my brother.
you know, and this is such a good moment for him to have and his family. Yeah, like I told him, like, dude, I'm gonna cry, dude. This is so cool, man. All the hard work that he's done, hard work that we've done together, gets his moment. He earned it, and he deserves it.
I wanted Ballin Studios to be the place where the best storytellers want to go. We know there is huge appetite amongst our incredible fans for hearing these stories in person, but we want to find every possible way to engage with our fans and get these stories out there. And we really believe that live storytelling events are going to be a big part of our offering.
What a privilege, huh?
I want them to leave thinking, my God, that guy can tell a story.
We are going to cover 4, maybe 5 stories. So basically see how it goes, 4 or 5 stories. This is called The Experiment, and it's new.
These are not just cool stories. These are real stories about real people. I knew the one thing that I've always been just fundamentally interested in is strange, dark.
I hope you all enjoyed that documentary as much as we did creating it. I will tell you that seriously, up until the last second before I walked on stage, I was so nervous, like so nervous. But as I walked out on stage to our theme song and this amazing audience of all you incredible, strange, dark, and mysterious fans, it was electric. I felt invincible up there, and all the nerves went away. And I just had the most incredible time. I can't thank you enough if you were there, and thank you for tuning in all the way to now, because now it's time for the big announcement that really is a product of how well that first live event went. Because I enjoyed that so much, and because it was so clear the audience did too, I've decided to do a full-blown tour. Starting on September 26th through October 20th of this year, you can find me in 15 different cities across the United States. And this show is going to be amazing. It's going to include never-before-heard stories on any of our channels or mediums, and also some good old-fashioned classics. And there's amazing set design and sound effects, and there's some interactive stuff going on. I mean, it's really an incredible show. We're really building off the success of that first show that was featured in the documentary. And guess what? Tickets for this tour are available right now. Like, literally right now. All you have to do is go to tour.ballenstudios.com, and in terms of what kind of tickets you can get, they range from general admission to VIP, and if you do the VIP package, you get to meet this guy. All right, pretty good, pretty good. And just for reference, the VIP tickets for that one show we did last year that was in this documentary, those sold out pretty much right away. So if that's the kind of thing that interests you, you really got to go to tour.ballenstudios right now and get those VIP tickets, because they're going to go. So that's going to do it. I can't wait to see you on this big tour. I'm seriously so excited. So go get your tickets. And seriously, thank you so much for all the support over the years. I wouldn't be able to do any of this without all of you. So thank you so much. And until next time, see ya. Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's hairspray with Gorilla Glue adhesive spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On February 24th, 2019, a woman arrived at a ceramics factory in Hubei province in China. She walked through the front door into the main office where she saw a desk attendant. She informed them she was a quality control inspector and she was there that day to inspect their vehicles. The attendant was accustomed to their company being periodically inspected, and so she asked the woman if she needed any help, and the woman said, "Nope, I'm just going to roam around your building, check what I need to check, and then I'll be out of here." And so the attendant told her that was totally fine, and if she needed anything, just come back and she would help her. And so the inspector thanked her and then turned around and went out the front door and checked the vehicles in the front lot of the ceramics factory. And then after she was done, she went back into the main office. She walked past the attendant and out the back door into the very active yard where all day long these huge bulldozers would move around thousands of pounds of sand. And so the inspector walked out that back door and she scanned the yard and she saw there were two bulldozers doing just that, moving all around. And then off to the left side, there was a dump truck that seemed to be stationary. And so very confidently, she just walked right into the yard and made her way over to that dump truck. And then when she got there, she flagged the driver down and said she was an inspector and that she was going to check the vehicle out. And so the driver helped her by turning on and off signals and moving back and forth. And then at some point, the inspector needed the dump truck driver to back up a significant distance. She needed to watch him do that. And so she, the inspector, backed away from the dump truck until she was in the middle of the yard, standing right in front of this parked bulldozer. What happens next is all caught on video. And so as she's standing there and she's watching the dump truck back up right in front of her, the bulldozer driver right behind her turns on the machine and immediately lurches forward. Now, the driver of this bulldozer did not see the woman, and she was in his blind spot right in front of the bucket of his bulldozer. And he was not aware there was somebody on foot walking around the yard. It's an extremely dangerous place to be on foot. And so he goes right into her and he knocks her backwards. She falls into the bucket. She starts screaming, but no one can hear her. It's so loud. And the driver drives the bucket directly into a pile of sand and scoops up thousands of pounds of sand that come down directly on this woman. So now she's completely buried alive and being crushed by all this sand. And then the driver, completely oblivious, lifts the bucket up, turns around and drives across the yard and dumps the sand and the woman into a vibrating sand crusher. The vibrating sand crusher is exactly what it sounds like. It pulverizes bits of rock and stone and grinds them down into a very fine powder. The machines come in various shapes and sizes, but this one inside of this ceramics factory was a top-loaded version, and it basically looked like a big dumpster with this big opening at the top. And so these bulldozer drivers would take these clumps of sand and they would dump it in this opening at the top of this bin. And then once they dumped their sand into the opening, the machine would vibrate, causing the sand to filter its way down towards the bottom of the machine, where there were these big, vicious metal claws that constantly smashed together and would just completely obliterate anything that passed through them. In the video, when the driver dumps his bucket load into the sand crusher, you can actually see the woman falling in, but then she immediately jumps into action and begins trying to pull herself up and out of this pile. And at some point, she gets most of her upper body out and she waves and she gets the attention of the driver who's just dumped her into the sand crusher. And the driver, he stops right away. You can see the vehicle lurch to a stop. He leaps out and he starts running over to the sand crusher. But as he's running over, this woman who's waving and waving, at some point her leg or some other part of her gets grabbed by those jaws at the bottom of the machine, and she's pulled slowly down into the sand crusher and disappears under the sand. When this happens, the driver is frantic and he's screaming for other people in the factory to come over and help. And at some point, the others inside, they realize there's an emergency and they all run over. But when they realize what's happened, that someone has fallen into the sand crusher, they all just stop and stand there because they know there's nothing they can do. The woman was gone. In June of 2015, 45-year-old James Young landed his dream job. For the last several years, James had been a 5th grade teacher in East Canton, Ohio, teaching special education. And while he loved his job and he loved the kids he worked with, he had always had his eye on becoming a guidance counselor for high school students. In 1988, James had actually graduated from East Canton, Ohio High School. And ever since his graduation, he had wanted to come back to the school and help the next generation of East Canton students prepare for their lives as adults. And a guidance counselor was designed to do just that. James had applied for the job job before, but every time he applied, they would tell him that while he was qualified, there just wasn't a spot open for him. However, at the end of that school year, he was told a guidance counselor spot had opened up at the high school and the job was his if he wanted it. And so, of course, James said, yes, I'll take the job. And immediately he told his mother about this amazing news. And his mother, who lived only a block away from him in East Canton, Ohio, would say that her son was so ecstatic about the job that normally when summer break was coming up, he would really look forward to that time off from school. But now that he had this new job to look forward to, he was already anxious for the summer to be over. James was a single man, but he was not lonely. He had a number of very close, lifelong friends that he would spend virtually all of his off time with. And that summer, he did just that. He went out with his friends, they explored all of Ohio and outside surrounding areas, they spent a lot of time outside, and they enjoyed each other's company. Towards the end of the summer, James and his friends knew it was time to schedule their annual trip to Cedar Point. Cedar Point is an amusement park about 2 hours northwest of East Canton, Ohio. It's situated right on the shores of Lake Erie, and it's known for its incredible roller coasters, of which they had 17, making them the park with the second most roller coasters in the world. Every summer, since James could remember, he and his very close friends would make a trip out to Cedar Point, usually at the end of the summer, to kind of cap off their vacation. After looking at their calendar, they decided that the best day to go would be Thursday, August 13th. This would give the group of friends one more fun thing to do before the following week James started his new job. So on the morning of that Thursday, the friends piled into a car and they made the 2-hour commute up to Cedar Point. And as soon as they got there, they went inside, they grabbed a map, and they began systematically hitting as many rides as they possibly could. And so by 4:30 p.m., they were totally exhausted. They'd been on virtually every ride. And so they were about to call it a day when James and his friends decide, hey, let's go on one more ride before we pack it in. And so they pull out their map and they're looking, and they realize they haven't gone on one of their favorite rides. It was called the Raptor. The Raptor was not Cedar Point's biggest roller coaster, but it was their fastest. It would reach a top speed of 57 miles per hour. Passengers are seated 4 across with their feet dangling below them in these suspended chairs with the big harness that comes down. And then once the ride starts, they're brought slowly up this 137-foot hill. And then at the top, they pause before being dropped down into this nearly 4,000-foot long track that spins them upside down 6 different times. So James and his friends, they closed up their map and they ran their way over to the Raptor. They got in line, and by 4:50 p.m., they had made it to the front of the line. They got into their seats, their harness came down, and then the ride started. And they were pulled up to the top of the hill, they paused, and then they were launched down the track. And for 2 minutes, they zipped and zagged and looped-de-looped all through this track. And then it was just suddenly over. And the friends had a great time on the ride. Except James realized about halfway through the ride, when they were upside down, his phone and wallet had come out of his pockets, and he actually saw them fall down towards the ground. And although he didn't see exactly where they landed, he had a pretty good idea of where they were. And so after they got off the ride, the friends were kind of talking about how much fun it was. And James said to them, hey, I lost my cell phone and wallet. Will you guys come with me while I go look for them? And so the friends agreed. They left the Raptor station and they walked down the paved path until they were in front of this fence that said no trespassing. And so James gets up to the fence and he's looking inside of this fenced-in area, and he sees right in the middle of this restricted area is his phone and his wallet. And before James's friends could tell him not to do this, he had climbed over the fence and entered into this restricted area. He ran over to his phone and his wallet, he picked it up, and then when he stood back up again, the next wave of Raptor riders came blazing through the area, and the underside, the steel underside of the ride, hit James right in the back of the head. He never saw it coming. It threw him forward, he landed on his face, and immediately the park officials saw this happen. They stopped the ride, but the riders on board the Raptor, they didn't know what was going on. And so they're stopped on the ride, they're looking down and they hear people screaming, and they look down and they see there's this man, James, lying face down on the ground with blood pooling around his head. The fence James had climbed over was there specifically to keep visitors from getting too close to this one low point in the Raptor ride where the ride can come through and it can hit you. And so medical workers, they rush over, they hop over the fence, they get to James, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead at the scene. That day, Cedar Park was put under investigation for James's death, but after reviewing the footage and talking to witnesses, the investigation was closed and they determined that the park was not at fault. James, despite being a very intelligent and sensible man, had a brief lapse in judgment, and it unfortunately cost him his life. Today, Cedar Park is still open for business and the Raptor ride is still operational. On August 14th, 2012, Celestino Cervantes picked up 28-year-old Victor Diaz for work. Celestino was an expert roofer, and he had just hired Victor to come on his crew and help him with a particular job. This was going to be Victor's first day as a roofer, but for the past 10 years he had worked in construction, so he was familiar with the operation. The two men arrived at their job site in San Antonio, Texas around 8 a.m. that morning. They were in charge of putting a new roof on a 115-year-old building that was being redeveloped into a fancy steakhouse. Until 2001, this building had been used by a brewing company to house their enormous boilers. As such, this building was referred to as the boiler house. Protruding from the boiler house roof was this large metal duct that was 15 feet long and almost looked like a covered walkway, and it connected to the side of this huge smokestack. This duct and smokestack used to be how the built-up condensation inside the boiler house was able to travel up and out of the building. When the two roofers got out of their truck, Celestino told Victor to take his tools and make his way up to the roof of the boiler house and get to work, and that he had a few things he had to do down on the ground floor, but he would be up to check on him in a little bit. Celestino turned around and was fiddling with his equipment inside of the truck while Victor made his way into the building and out of sight. An hour and a half later, Celestino went up to the roof to check on Victor, but he couldn't find Victor anywhere and he couldn't find his tools anywhere. So Celestino went back down into the main section of this building where other contractors that were working on this renovation were, and he began asking them, hey, have you seen this guy, Victor? He works with me, I can't find him, and no one had seen him. And so Celestino's thinking to himself, well, I guess Victor must have left. But that didn't really make any sense because Victor didn't have a vehicle and he didn't live nearby. But Celestino's thinking, you know what, maybe somebody came and picked him up. Now, unfortunately, Victor did not carry a cell phone, so nobody had any way of getting directly in contact with him. So Celestino leaves the building and he calls Victor's brother and he asks him, have you seen Victor? Do you know where he might have gone? And Victor's brother says, no, I haven't seen him since this morning when he left with you. So Victor's brother began calling around to friends and family and asked them if they had seen Victor, but nobody knew where he was. So for the rest of the day, Celestino and the rest of Victor's friends and family, they went out looking for Victor at the job site and around the surrounding areas, but there was just no sign of him. And so that night, Victor's brother went to the police to file a missing person report. But the police told him that it was really too early to file a report because Victor was an adult and there was no sign of foul play, and that he should just come back in a day or two if Victor still has not shown up. 2 days go by and Victor had still not shown up, so Victor's sister-in-law went back to the police and says, okay, now I want to file a missing person report. We don't know where he is, no one can get in touch with him, we need your help. But the officer she spoke to told her that she still needed to wait another 5 days to process this request. It would turn out this was just not true. It was a mistake. There was no arbitrary waiting period to file a missing person report. So without any help from the police, Victor's friends and family and co-workers spent the next several days scouring San Antonio, scouring the job site, looking everywhere for him and handing out flyers and asking people if they'd seen him, but no one had. He had just disappeared. By Monday the following week, so 6 days after Victor has gone missing, his family had printed out dozens of these huge posters with his face on them and a number to call if you had any information about him, and their plan was to distribute them the following morning all over San Antonio. But the following morning, before they headed out, they got a call. Victor had been found. 7 days earlier, when Celestino told Victor to head inside and make his way to the roof and begin the project, Victor had gotten his tools, gone inside, he made his way up the stairwell to the second floor, and then he made a series of odd decisions. Instead of making his way to the access door and climbing his way up to the roof, he went to the far side of the second floor where there were all these wooden barriers preventing people from going any farther. He climbed over all these barriers and he reached the entrance to that huge duct where the condensation used to go. And so from his perspective, he would have been looking into this duct and it would have been completely pitch black because it connected to that smokestack and the smokestack was totally sealed off. But despite not having any idea where this tunnel goes and it clearly not being the place Celestino told him to go, Victor decides to just get into this tunnel, which required bending over because it was only 4 feet tall and 5 feet wide. So he gets inside of this tunnel and he begins shuffling his way deeper and deeper into this tunnel until he reaches the end of the tunnel where it actually connects into the smokestack. Now at the top of this duct where it connects to the smokestack, there wasn't a grate or bars or any sort of barrier that would stop you from spilling into the smokestack. And because it was totally pitch black, Victor, when he made it to the edge of that duct, he just kept on walking and fell 20 feet down to the bottom of the smokestack. And so in total darkness, Victor, who was probably badly hurt from the fall, began feeling around the inside of the chimney looking for a way out. And and he eventually found a hatch that was big enough for him to fit through, but when he felt up against it, he realized it was locked from the outside and it wouldn't even budge. He couldn't even get light to come in through a crack. It was totally sealed off. And that was the only way out of the smokestack, unless he could get back up to the duct, but there was no way to do that. He most likely began screaming for help, but he was encased in thick brick, and so his sound wouldn't have traveled. It would have been completely muffled. Plus, the smokestack was fairly far away from the job site, which was very noisy as it is, and so there was just no way they could have heard him. And the smokestack and the duct were not part of the renovation, and so there was absolutely no foot traffic over around the smokestack. He was completely alone, no one knew he was there, and there was no way out. 7 days after Victor fell into the smokestack, workers over at the job site, they noticed this huge swarm of flies over around the base of the smokestack. There were so many flies over there, they decided they had to go investigate. And so as they walked closer and closer to the smokestack, they were hit with this overwhelming stench of death and decay. And then when they got to the smokestack, they could see the flies were centralized on that hatch at the bottom. And so they cut the lock, they opened it up, and inside they found Victor's body. And they saw his hands were badly bloodied and bruised, and they were pressed up against the inside of the hatch, indicating in his final moments he was desperately trying to open that hatch and save himself, but there was just no way to do that. Although no one knows this for sure, it's believed Victor confused the condensation duct with the access point to the roof. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's hairspray with Gorilla Glue adhesive spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
On the morning of December 10th, 1995, a seasoned homicide detective walked into a house on a quiet street in the suburbs of Tucson, Arizona. Another officer led him down the hallway to a bedroom, and when the detective looked inside, he froze. Now, he'd seen a lot of crime scenes before, but this one had to be one of the worst. I mean, there was blood everywhere. All over the walls, all over the floors, the mattress. I mean, it was just a complete nightmare. But as much as it appeared like clearly he's looking at the scene of a murder, there was a problem. There was no body. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please hide mousetraps in all of the like button shoes. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of December 8th, 1995, a 41-year-old mother named Bonnie Sanborn set a box of cereal down on the dining room table inside of her home in Tucson, Arizona. She then called for her 3 kids to come eat breakfast, and just a few seconds later, her youngest son, 10-year-old Brandon, came bombing into the room and sat down at the table. Bonnie then poured herself a cup of coffee and carried it down the hallway to her 13-year-old daughter Candace's room. Candace was busy putting on makeup, and when Bonnie reminded her that it was almost time to leave for school, she just rolled her eyes and said, she'd be out in a minute. Then Bonnie continued going down the hallway and knocked on the door of her 15-year-old son Bradley's room. And when he didn't open the door, she shouted through the door that if he didn't get out of bed soon, she would come in there and literally drag him out. But there was still no response after she did this, so Bonnie put her ear to the door and listened for movement. She was hoping to hear sheets rustling or dresser drawers opening, but she didn't hear those sounds. Instead, she heard a different sound. It was like this weird clanking sound, like metal pounding against metal.
And so because this noise was so unusual, she just opened up the door and she found her son, Bradley, along with his friend, 18-year-old Jason Horbachevsky, squatting in the middle of the room, trying to pry open this big metal box with a crowbar and a hammer. Bonnie stepped fully inside the room to get a better look, and she saw there was a phone receiver dangling off the side of this metal box. It was clearly a payphone that Bradley and Jason had clearly stolen from somewhere out on the street, and now they were trying to, steal the quarters out from inside of it. Bonnie was so shocked that all she could think to do was just say, "What are you doing?" And Bradley, he looked at his mom and just seemed totally unfazed that she was in there, and he just said, "What? We're just trying to get the change out of this payphone." And then before she could react to that, Jason, so her son's friend, he looked over his shoulder at her also very nonchalantly and just began laughing in a way that made Bonnie wonder if he was high on something. At this point, Bonnie just stepped back into the hallway and just tried to think through what she should even do here. I mean, this is so obvious that they're committing a crime in her house right now. Like, what in the world? But at the same time, she'd been having problems with her son Bradley for a long time now. This was definitely not the first time she had caught her son, doing something bad. Her son had been known to throw parties in their house that he definitely was not supposed to. He would pick fights with basically everybody in the house, all the family members. And on top of that, she also knew that periodically he would hang out with known gang members. Now, for a while, Bonnie had tried to be understanding and supportive because she remembered how hard it was to be a teenager herself. But her son's trouble really just kept escalating. And this payphone thing was like a breaking point. She knew she could not let something like this slide. I mean, it was literally criminal, and so obviously so. And if she didn't step in now, it was clear her son would just continue to push the limits further and further until he got hurt or got somebody else hurt or, wound up in jail or something. Like, this was the moment she had to put her foot down. And so, without saying another word to her son or Jason, who were now back to banging on this metal box, she just turned and walked back into the kitchen where her other kids, Brandon and Candace, were now eating their breakfast and looking annoyed by all the chaos being caused by their older brother. And she walked right past them, picked up the phone, and she called 911. And when the dispatcher picked up her call, Bonnie said she wanted to report a theft, and she gave the dispatcher her own address. And then after she hung up, she told Candace and Brandon to go get their backpacks and go outside so they didn't miss the bus. A few minutes later, Bonnie heard a knock on the front door, and she opened it up to find two sheriff's deputies standing on the doorstep. She actually recognized the deputies, and she knew they also recognized her, because this was not the first time they'd been called to the Sanborn house. They'd been there several times actually recently to deal with domestic issues, largely caused by her son. But Bonnie knew, Bradley, even though he was the obvious main problem, at least in terms of her current issues, she was already seeing that her 13-year-old child, Candace, had begun acting out a lot lately. And she was also worried what would happen when her 10-year-old, Brandon, became a teenager himself. Like, would he begin, following the footsteps of his brother and maybe his older sister as well? She didn't know, but she just couldn't understand why her kids just were misbehaving so much. Like, what did she do wrong? And so Bonnie showed the deputies to Bradley's room, where he and Jason were still actively trying to pry open this payphone. And when Bradley looked up and saw the police, he looked furious. He screamed at his mother that he couldn't believe she'd called the cops on him. But Bonnie, she did her best to push down the natural bit of guilt she was feeling, because she didn't want to have to call the cops on her son. The deputies ultimately handcuffed both Bradley and Jason, and they walked them outside, and Bonnie trailed right behind them. And then as the police were putting the kids in the back of the squad car, Bonnie pulled one of the deputies aside and asked if he could make sure Bradley spent at least one night in the juvenile detention center. She knew this was a very tough love sort of approach. I mean, basically demanding your kid stays effectively in jail overnight. But she was also hoping that in addition to being maybe scared straight here, he would also get counseling in the juvenile detention center and maybe begin to see the value of staying out of trouble. The deputy nodded and said he'd see what he could do. As the squad car drove away, Bonnie saw movement in a window of the house across the street. She squinted and saw that one of her neighbors was peering out the curtains to get a look at all the commotion. And then further down the street, a couple out for a morning jog had slowed down and was just staring at the squad car as they passed by. And now for Bonnie, I mean, she wasn't that surprised. I mean, she'd be looking out the window too if police showed up on her street. But at the same time, it still made her very embarrassed. I mean, she knew people in this neighborhood were already very aware of her family's problems, and it was a lot to bear. And frankly, making it even worse was the fact that, generally speaking, Bonnie's neighbors were nice to her in person when they were face to face with her. People even went out of their way to help her, but she knew behind her back, people in this neighborhood gossiped constantly about her family. Now, for Bonnie, this was obviously humiliating and also very frustrating because how could she possibly stop gossip? I mean, she couldn't. But more than just disliking the fact that there were all these people talking about her, she also just felt very isolated right now. She was married, but her husband Robert had gotten a job in Maryland, and he only came home every other weekend. Bonnie had actually tried to sell the house in Tucson and move the whole family to Maryland, but she'd eventually decided it just wasn't really worth the trouble. Plus, Robert had already talked to his supervisor about potentially transferring back to Tucson, and he was supposed to be coming back for good just next week. And so at this point, Bonnie was just trying to survive here. She still felt very isolated, but she knew, Robert, he'd be back soon, and she wouldn't be alone anymore, and she would get to deal with the kids, with the nosy neighbors, with the police, with her partner. It just felt like that would be a whole lot better. About 16 hours later, around 11:45 p.m. that night, Bonnie brushed her teeth and put on her PJs. The house was quiet for once, except for the TV humming in the living room. She'd gotten a call from the juvenile detention center that afternoon, and Bradley was being held there on theft charges, which Bonnie thought was for the best. But his friend Jason was 18 years old, so he was not held. Instead, he was just given a ticket and released the same day. And Bonnie knew that as soon as Bradley was out again, he and Jason would reconnect right away and just fall right back into their same old antics. Before she went to bed, Bonnie went to the living room where her other two kids, Candace and Brandon, were on the couch watching TV. And she told them it was time for bed, time to turn off the TV and go to your rooms, but they just ignored her and just continued to watch TV. It was a Friday night, and the two kids didn't have anywhere to be in the morning, and Bonnie had just done enough fighting for the day. So she just decided, you know what? Let them stay up. They can go to bed when they want to. And so she told the kids to, don't stay up too late and go to bed soon. Then she left, leaving them on the couch. She went to her own bedroom and she turned out her lights. A few hours later, Bonnie woke up and looked over at the clock and saw it was near 3 a.m. And she also could still hear the TV on out in the living room. And so Bonnie cracked open her door and yelled down the hallway to the kids to turn off the TV and go to bed. And then as Bonnie got back in her bed, she heard the sound of the TV turning off and she heard footsteps walking down the hallway, and then the house was quiet. And she drifted back to sleep. But sometime before dawn, when it was still dark out, she woke up again. And when she rolled over in her bed, she opened her eyes and she saw there was a large figure standing over her bed. Later that same morning, around 10:45 a.m., 10-year-old Brandon woke up to a eerily silent house. Normally, his mother would have already been awake, making breakfast or getting started on chores. But when he went out in the hallway, he didn't hear her. He went into the kitchen and he checked to see if she was there, but she wasn't. And there were no dirty pans or plates in the sink and no coffee in the pot. It looked like his mom hadn't even woke up yet, which was weird for a Saturday morning. So he went to ask his older sister, Candace, if she knew where their mom was. But Candace said she hadn't seen her. So Brandon and Candace both went down the hallway to their mother's bedroom. They knocked on the door, and when she didn't answer, Brandon pushed the door open and looked inside. And what he saw made him gasp in horror. The bedroom was covered in blood, but the bedroom was also empty. His mom wasn't in there. Let me tell you about my newfound favorite treat. The other day, I had some family and friends over, and I couldn't wait to introduce them to my mochi. We all shared the mango, the strawberry, and cookies and cream, and unsurprisingly, everybody loved it. We even made a quick run to the supermarket afterwards to get more. Because sometimes the most simple pleasures in life bring the most joy, like the joyfully chill sensation of biting into refreshing, creamy, chewy My Mochi ice cream. My Mochi ice cream is like this sweet ice cream dumpling. Creamy, premium ice cream wrapped in very satisfying, sweet, chewy dough that is both refreshing and indulgent. It comes in delicious flavors like strawberry, cookies and cream, and mango. My mochi is only around 70 calories per piece, and it's easy to share because each box comes with 6 individual mochis. If you haven't tried my mochi, you really don't want to miss out on this joyfully chill experience. Look for the purple box of my mochi ice cream in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store.
Later that same morning, Detective Brad Faust pulled up outside of a house in the suburbs of Tucson. He was there to investigate a mother's apparent kidnapping from her own home. Faust was actually feeling a bit frustrated to be called out to yet another case like this when he was already juggling so many others. 1995 had proven to be the deadliest year in Tucson's history. There had already been nearly 100 murders just that year, and the Pima County Sheriff's Office was swamped. But as far as anyone knew at this point, this was not a murder, it was a kidnapping. All Faust had been told was that Bonnie Sanborn was missing, and her kids had called 911 after seeing that and also seeing all the blood in her bedroom. So Faust was holding out hope here that this was actually nothing that serious, and that they would find Bonnie relatively quickly and she'd be okay. He got out of his car and he saw that officers had already taped off the house. There was a young boy and girl sitting out on the front curb, looking terrified and visibly distraught. And Faust also noticed that there was blood on both of their shirts, and so he figured that they must be Bonnie's kids, the ones who had made the 911 call, and he made a mental note that he would need to talk to them later. Then he walked through the front yard and went into the house, and right away a crime scene photographer greeted him and then led him down the hallway. As he walked, Faust caught a glimpse of a family photo on the wall, which showed Bonnie and her husband and their 3 kids, all smiling and looking like the perfect all-American family. Before opening the door to Bonnie's bedroom, the photographer paused and warned the detective that there really was a lot of blood in here. Faust nodded, and then the photographer opened the door, and Faust immediately saw what he was talking about. There was blood spattered all over the walls, the floor, the windows, and the mattress. He felt his heart sink as he realized that with this much blood loss, they probably would not be finding their victim alive here. But he knew it was going to be very hard to figure out what had happened here or who was responsible until they found her, dead or alive. And so Faust stepped into the room closer to the bed, where a forensic technician was swabbing for fingerprints. The mattress was completely soaked in blood, and on one of the pillows, he could clearly see a bloody handprint. He figured it either belonged to Bonnie or her kidnapper, but they'd have to wait for test results to be sure. Faust stepped back, and he noticed that the sheets had been partially pulled off the bed and were sort of balled up on the middle of the mattress. And to him, it seemed like, given how much blood is in here and the fact that obviously Bonnie is not here, that clearly some sort of long and violent struggle took place in this room. And it seemed to him like the struggle must have originated on the bed, and maybe even the bulk of the struggle was happening on the bed. It's soaked in blood and the sheets are all messed up. And he's thinking, very likely then Bonnie was in bed when the attack began. Faust also noticed there was a folding knife with a red handle on the mattress, and there was also a purse that had been poured out. There were multiple credit cards and a checkbook that were just sitting on the bed, and the fact that these items were not stolen made Faust think that robbery probably was not part of the motive for whatever happened to Bonnie. But then, something on the floor by the bed caught Faust's eye. After double-checking that the room had already been photographed, Faust put on a pair of gloves and then crouched down and he picked it up. And what it was a small brown button. He carried it over to the closet and dug through Bonnie's clothes that were in there, and the button didn't seem to match anything that she owned. And so based on where it was found in the room, Faust thought, this button must have come off of somebody's clothes in the middle of this attack. It obviously could belong to Bonnie. It could have come off of what she was wearing and maybe is still wearing. Or this button could have come off of the attacker's clothes. And so Faust gave the button to a forensics officer and told him to bag it up. Then he kept looking around. And in the midst of all the blood that had been sprayed all over the room, he noticed there was a clear trail of red droplets that snaked across the carpet. The trail led to a sliding glass door that led into the backyard. And when he tried to open it, he realized it was already unlocked. The forensics officer told him that nobody had touched that door all morning, so it must have been unlocked before anybody arrived. Faust slid the door open and stepped out into the backyard, and he followed the trail of blood across the grass all the way to a door that led into the garage. He noticed there were no drag marks in the grass, so Bonnie's attacker must have been carrying her, which sort of naturally suggested that whoever did this
likely was bigger and stronger than Bonnie. But also, judging from the photos he'd seen on the walls, Bonnie was very petite, so really that didn't narrow it down very much. A lot of people could potentially lift Bonnie and carry her. Faust reached the door that led into the garage, and he turned the knob, and it was unlocked. He opened it up, and when he looked inside, there wasn't a car in there. But the trail of blood clearly went into the garage at least a few feet before it disappeared, so it seemed like the suspect had literally carried Bonnie in here, loaded her into the car that likely was in here and now was not, and they drove it away, carrying Bonnie with them. And so Faust knew his best shot at finding Bonnie was to, 1, identify the car that would normally be in this garage, and then once you have the identity of the car, to go find it. Once Faust had done his initial sweep of the house, he went outside and he crouched down next to Bonnie's 2 younger kids, Candace and Brandon. And both kids were still very shaken up and totally confused. And so Faust very gently asked them about the last time they had seen their mother. And Candace said it was around maybe 11:45 the night before when their mom had gone to bed. But she also added that maybe around 3 a.m., she and her brother Brandon were still up watching TV in the living room, and their mom had shouted from her bedroom for them to turn off the TV and go to bed. She said that when their mom did that, they did get up, they turned off the TV, and they went to their own bedrooms and went to sleep. And both kids said they didn't hear or see anything until they woke up later that morning and found what they found in their mother's bedroom. And so this gave Faust something to work with, because it meant, if what the kids were saying was true, that Bonnie must have disappeared sometime after 3 a.m., because that's when she yelled to her kids at 3. Plus, if the suspect came in through that back sliding door that went right into Bonnie's room, and they were able to do so without waking up the kids, and then after the attack being able to find very likely Bonnie's car keys, because that's the assumption, they found her keys and then loaded Bonnie into the car and drove off, again without waking anybody in the house, it suggested that whoever did this, they likely were relatively familiar with the layout of the house and had probably been there before. So maybe this is somebody that they all knew. Faust pointed to the blood that was on Candace and Brandon's shirts, and he asked them where it came from. And Candace would admit that before she called 911, she and her brother had desperately gone looking for their mom in the room, in this horrible bloody bedroom, but they couldn't find her, and in their efforts to find her, they had gotten blood on themselves. Now, of course, Faust understood that these kids had been through this horribly traumatic thing, and they were just looking for their mom, but he also now knew that very likely their crime scene was contaminated now because the kids went in there and touched a bunch of stuff. But, of course, he did not tell the kids that he was in any way annoyed with them or that they had done anything wrong. Instead, he just told the kids to go inside and change their clothes and then give the clothes that had blood on them to the forensics techs because they needed to collect them as evidence. And he also told the kids to not go anywhere near their mother's bedroom. Candace nodded and stood up and grabbed her little brother by the hand, and as they walked back towards the house, a sheriff's deputy came up to Faust and told the detective that he should also make sure to talk to Bonnie's oldest child. She had a 15-year-old son whose name was Bradley. That evening, Detective Faust paced down the hallway of the Pima County Juvenile Court Center, holding a file folder in his hand. When he opened the door to a small office, a teenage boy was already there waiting, and Faust recognized him from the mugshot in the folder he had as Bradley Sanborn, Bonnie's oldest child. Faust walked in, and as gently as he could, he told Bradley that his mother was missing. And based on the blood and the knife they'd found in her bedroom, she'd likely been viciously attacked, kidnapped, and she could even be dead. So Faust knew that Bradley could not have attacked his mother because he'd been here in the juvenile detention center the whole time the attack took place. But Faust had done some digging on Bradley's friends. He slapped the file folder he was carrying down onto the desk in front of Bradley and began flipping through it, showing Bradley the information he'd found about, in particular, his friend Jason Horbachevsky. Jason was a known gang member, and according to several informants, he was known for carrying a knife around. And sometimes, apparently, he would pull that knife out and stab himself in the side of the head. And so Faust wondered out loud if the knife they'd found in Bonnie's bedroom was Bradley's friend Jason's. And maybe the attack on her was retribution for his mother calling the cops on Jason and Bradley that morning. But when Faust looked at Bradley for his reaction, He saw there were all these tears rolling down his cheeks, and Bradley choked out that he really didn't know anything, and as much as he argued with his mom, he would never hurt her. To Faust, Bradley's reaction actually seemed really genuine, and so he immediately figured that if the gang Jason was a part of, was responsible for whatever happened to Bonnie, Bradley appeared out of the loop. And so to get a better read on this situation, Faust felt like, trying to ask Bradley questions was not going to go very far. Instead, he would just go to Jason and talk to him. Later that same night, Faust sat in the station with a cup of coffee, combing through records on Bradley and also on Jason and Jason's gang. After speaking to Bradley earlier, Faust had immediately tried to locate and interview Jason, which proved to be much more difficult than he'd anticipated. He knew Jason was not in police custody since he'd been released pretty much immediately after the payphone debacle. But Jason also was not at any addresses that he'd been associated with in the past, so it was hard to tell where he even was. So, a few hours ago, Faust had sent out officers to speak to as many members of Jason's gang as possible to see if they knew where he was, and also to see if they knew anything about Bonnie. Now, so far, they had not located Jason, and nobody had brought anything up about Bonnie, but just then, Faust's office door opened, and a deputy told him there was someone he really ought to speak to that was out in the lobby. And so Faust got up, he went in the lobby, and who was waiting for him but none other than Jason. When Faust walked out there, Jason stood up from his chair, acting cocky and confident, and told Faust that he'd heard the sheriff's department was looking for him, and he was there to prove he had nothing to hide. And Faust, he didn't even bother asking where Jason had been. Instead, he just led him into an interrogation room, and when he sat down across from his newest suspect, he noticed the buttons on Jason's shirt. They were small and brown, just like the button that was found on Bonnie's bedroom floor. And also, a few of the buttons on his shirt appeared to be missing. Now, Faust controlled his excitement and didn't show it, and decided pretty much right away that he was not going to ask about the button, at least not at first. He didn't want to overplay his hand. Instead, he started the interview by asking Jason some standard questions about his relationship with Bradley, and also by extension, his relationship with Bonnie, Bradley's mom, and also where Jason was at the time of the attack. And Jason would admit that he was mad about Bonnie calling the police on him and Bradley. But he didn't have some big plan to get revenge. He insisted that he didn't know where Bonnie was or what had happened to her, and he'd been at home asleep on the night she was attacked. And at the end of the interview, he agreed to give Faust a DNA sample, and he even turned over his shirt with the missing brown buttons for forensic analysis. And so after that, Faust released Jason and decided it was time to call it a day.
You know those moments right before you start something new, when you're staring at the idea, running through every worst-case scenario, and wondering if you're making a huge mistake? That feeling of doubt and uncertainty can be paralyzing. But looking back, making that leap, despite the fear I had, was one of the best decisions I ever made when I started this Mr. Ballin adventure. Because sometimes the scariest step forward is the one that changes everything. Starting something new isn't just hard, it really is terrifying, especially when you're starting a business. But that's why it helps to have such a great partner like Shopify by your side. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses all around the world, from household names like Death Wish Coffee and Magic Spoon to brands just getting started. It's time to turn those what-ifs into sales with Shopify today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/MrBallin. Go to shopify.com/MrBallin. Again, that's shopify.com/MrBallin.
The next morning, Sunday, December 10th, so a day after Bonnie went missing, Faust sat in his office and sorted through all the information his team had collected the day before. While Faust had interviewed Bradley and Jason, other members of his team had spoken to Bonnie's friends, family, and neighbors. But so far, it looked like nobody knew anything that was helpful. A few neighbors had mentioned that the Sanborns had family problems, but apart from that, they all said Bonnie seemed nice, and they had no idea who would want to hurt her. Faust continued reading, looking for some kind of clue in all the interviews, when his office phone rang. He picked it up, and the man on the line sounded terrified, and he said he had a tip in the Bonnie Sanborn case. The man explained that earlier that morning, he'd seen a news report about Bonnie's disappearance and how the detectives were looking for her car, which the police had learned was a light blue Chrysler. And he said that just the day before, he and his wife had actually passed a car just like that on their morning run. It was abandoned on the side of the road in the desert just outside of town. He said at the time, he and his wife had not gotten too close to the car, and they really hadn't thought much of it until they had seen this news report. And so after seeing the report just a few minutes ago, he and his wife had gone back to the desert to see if the car was still there. And he said not only was the car still there, but when they walked up close, they could see in the back seat what appeared to be a woman's body. Faust immediately wrote down the car's location, and when he looked at a map, he realized it was only about a half-mile away from Bonnie's house. He thanked the man, hung up the phone, and then he got in his car and he raced out toward the desert. And when he got past the edge of town into the open desert, he saw right up ahead a light blue Chrysler parked in the sand. He stopped his car on the shoulder near the car, he got out, and he approached the Chrysler, and he peered through the window, and almost immediately, he did see a woman's body. It was Bonnie's body, and she was slumped over in the back seat, just as the man had said. Bonnie's arms were bound behind her back, and there was a sock stuffed in her mouth, and the lower half of her body was naked. And for Faust, in seeing this, he wasn't surprised, but at the same time, he had held out hope that maybe Bonnie was alive. Just seeing her dead in such a horrible way in the back of this car it was heartbreaking. And so Faust went back to his car, he radioed the station, and he waited until a forensics team arrived. And then at that point, he went back over to the Chrysler, and he began to examine the body. Faust put on gloves, and he leaned into the car, and he lifted up Bonnie's head. And he found there were wounds all over her skull, as if she'd been repeatedly struck in the head with something very sharp. And her partial nudity made it seem likely that she was also sexually assaulted. There were also clear defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, which suggested she had fought back hard against her killer. One of the forensics officers pulled out a black light and began running it across the back seat of the car to check for potential DNA evidence. And Faust watched as the forensics officer ran the light over Bonnie's leg, and it lit up a spot. And the officer told Faust that almost definitely that spot was the killer's semen. And so he swabbed the area and put the swab into an evidence bag and told Faust that in a matter of maybe a few weeks, they should get the DNA profile back from the lab and maybe they'd know who their killer was. In the meantime, the fingerprints found in Bonnie's bedroom were analyzed, and they had come back with a match that really surprised Detective Faust. All the fingerprints and that bloody handprint on the pillow belonged to Bonnie's 13-year-old daughter, Candace. And even though Faust really did not want to consider that a 13-year-old girl had in some way helped with a plot to kill her own mother, he now had to consider it, not only because of the handprint and fingerprints, but also because there was a long record of family problems inside of the Sanborn house. Now, obviously, Candace could not have committed this crime on her own, but she certainly could have helped whoever did. So, Faust confronted Candace, and when he did, she just broke down sobbing. She said she had just been really scared and confused and was just looking in the bedroom for her mom and just didn't realize what she was doing by getting her prints everywhere. And looking at this scared teenager, Faust knew that Candace really didn't make sense as a potential suspect here. But he still felt like Bonnie's killer had to be somebody who knew Bonnie personally and had been in her house before. And there was one person who still had not been ruled out: Bonnie's husband, Robert. Later that day, Faust was sitting at his desk with the phone pressed to his ear. He was on hold and had been for some time, and as he tried to tune out the awful music that was playing on the line, he looked down at the handwritten list of airline names and flight numbers that were on his desk. Bonnie's husband, Robert, had been working in Maryland for the past couple of months, and he had not been scheduled to come back home to Tucson on the weekend his wife was killed. But just because he claimed that he had been in Maryland that whole weekend, didn't mean he actually was. There were multiple flights from Maryland back to Tucson that in theory he could have secretly taken to come home, kill his wife, and then go back to work in time for his next shift. So Faust had compiled a list of every single flight Robert could have theoretically taken, and one by one he was calling the airlines to check the passenger manifests. And so far there hadn't been a Robert Sanborn on any of the flights he had checked, and now he'd made it to the very last flight on that list. And just then, the on-hold music suddenly cut out, and the woman on the line told Faust that she had triple-checked, and there was no Robert Sanborn on that flight either, the one from Maryland to Tucson. And he thanked her, hung up, and sighed. Now, keep in mind, this took place before the events that happened on 9/11. Since 9/11, air travel has been much more rigidly controlled, especially in the United States. I mean, security is so much higher. But pre-9/11, that really wasn't the case. I mean, people didn't even necessarily have to show their ID to get on a domestic flight. And so Faust knew right now, even though he's being told that Robert's name didn't show up on the manifest of any of these flights, it didn't really rule him out, because he could have theoretically been traveling under a fake name. But there was a next step that would show if Robert had something to do with this, and that would be to ask Robert for a DNA sample, and hope that when the evidence came back from the lab, it would be conclusive enough to give a clear answer. One morning in early January of 1996, so about a month after Bonnie was murdered, Faust answered his office phone and he heard a tech from the crime lab on the other end. In the past few weeks, there had been 5 more murders in the Tucson area that Faust and his team were now dealing with. So when the lab tech said he had results in the Bonnie Sanborn case, it actually took Faust a few seconds to remember which murder that was for. But once he remembered, he quickly sat down at his desk and he grabbed a pen to take notes. And he held his breath as the lab tech told him that they had tested the sample found on Bonnie's leg, and it was not a match for her husband Robert, nor was it a match for her son's friend, Jason Horbachevsky. Those brown buttons on Jason's shirt also didn't come back as matching the button that was found in Bonnie's bedroom, so it really was just a coincidence that they looked alike to the naked eye. Faust was disappointed, but he knew this was going to be a possibility, and he had a backup plan. He asked the lab tech to run the DNA sample against the DNA of every sex offender on the state registry to see if there was a match there. But as the crime lab slowly began doing that, they kept calling Faust to update him that they had not found a match yet. And eventually, the search for a DNA match ultimately just stalled, and Faust was pulled onto other cases. And so by that summer, it was looking like Bonnie's murder case might go cold. Then, after 9 months without any progress, an anonymous tip came in. That summer, in September of 1996, Detective Faust sat inside of an interrogation room at the sheriff's department across from a 40-year-old drug dealer named Lyle Winstead. The anonymous tipster had said that Lyle had sold drugs to several people in Bonnie's neighborhood, and he'd said some things about the case that the tipster thought were very concerning. And when Faust had dug through Lyle's records, he'd found that Lyle had a history of violent crimes involving knives. Sitting inside the interrogation room, Lyle seemed obviously nervous and very jumpy. And when Faust started asking him questions about Bonnie's murder, Lyle made excuses for the killer, saying that maybe the killer wasn't such a bad guy. Maybe he was just, quote, on a bad trip. Now, Faust thought this was incredibly suspicious to be talking that way, so he asked Lyle for a DNA sample. And he got one, and he sent it off to the crime lab. And Faust had to wait several weeks for the results, and when they finally came in, Lyle Winstead was not a match. And at that point, Faust was feeling really frustrated. I mean, they'd already put in so much work with really nothing to show for it, and he didn't want the momentum on the case to die again. So before he put Bonnie's file back on the shelf, he decided to go back to square one and make sure there wasn't anything he just plain missed. The next month, between all the other cases he was working on, Faust found time to go literally door to door through Bonnie's neighborhood and re-interview everybody his team had already spoken to almost a year ago. Faust knew how gossip spread in quiet communities like this one, and even though nobody had been able to offer any leads the first time around, he wondered if maybe anything unusual might have surfaced since then. So he knocked on one door after another, and eventually, at a house down the street, a woman told him that she didn't know anything personally, but there was a rumor circulating around the neighborhood that he might want to look into. So Faust did. And after so many frustrating dead ends to this point, it was ultimately this rumor that did allow him to solve the case. Based on that rumor, and also DNA and other evidence that was later uncovered, this is what police believe happened to Bonnie Sanborn on December 9th, 1995. Around 2:30 in the morning, Bonnie's killer watched her house from a hiding spot where nobody could see them. The killer knew the Sanborns had been trying to move to Maryland, but the killer felt like before they did go to Maryland, if they did that, there was something the killer had to do. Around 3 a.m., as the killer was watching the house, they saw the light in Bonnie's living room finally go dark. And then the killer saw some movement behind the curtains in one of the bedroom windows, and then that lamp went out, leaving the entire house completely dark. The killer had intentionally waited for this moment. They wanted to make sure that not just Bonnie, but her children were asleep by the time they went inside. And so now that the lights were off and that it seemed like the coast was clear, the killer grabbed their flex ties and also their chipping hammer and then began making their way towards the home. A chipping hammer is a very particular type of hammer that has a sort of typical one side that you would use to strike something, but the back of that hammer is sharp, almost like a pickaxe. And so with this barbaric tool they were about to use in hand, they slowly crept their way across Bonnie's backyard right up to the sliding glass door at the back of the house. And they found it was unlocked, just like they thought it would be. After all, they'd been to this house before, they sort of understood this one typically stayed unlocked, and they also knew what was on the other side of this door. It was Bonnie's bedroom. After sliding open the door, the killer stepped in, and they found Bonnie, asleep under the covers in her bed. And so thinking here was their chance, the killer began moving towards the bed. But as they stepped closer, a floorboard creaked, and Bonnie stirred awake. And she rolled over and looked in the direction of the creaking sound and made eye contact with the killer, and the killer knew they had to strike. Bonnie tried to fight back, but it was no use. The killer completely overpowered her. Once Bonnie stopped struggling, but before she stopped breathing, the killer used those flex ties to bind her hands behind her back. Then, as she was laying there, unable to defend herself, they searched around for her purse, and when they found it, they dumped it out on the bed, and after they had emptied it, they found her car keys. And so they grabbed the keys, and then the killer picked up Bonnie, still very much alive, and they carried her out that sliding door into the backyard and then out into the garage. There, they used her car keys to unlock Bonnie's car, the blue Chrysler, and they put Bonnie in the back seat. Then they hopped in the driver's seat and they drove the car out into the desert where they parked on the side of the road. When the killer was done with Bonnie, they simply got out of the car and left it where it was and walked back into town. And as the sun began to rise, the killer wandered right back down Bonnie Street in the direction of the Sanborn house. It would turn out Detective Faust had been so focused on finding the killer amongst Bonnie's immediate family and friends that he really hadn't even considered somebody else who was literally physically closest to the Sanborns, her across-the-street neighbor, 22-year-old Freddie Royval. Now, Freddie was not actually, emotionally close with the Sanborns, but he and his dad had, in the past, gone out of their way to help Bonnie, by doing some repair work at her house. But what Faust had learned when he had gone back and re-interviewed all the people on the street to see if he had missed something, one of the other neighbors, who was not remotely involved in what happened to Bonnie, told Faust that there was actually a rumor that Freddie had found Bonnie attractive. And there was also another rumor floating around that Faust learned that previously a woman had been assaulted by a younger man in this neighborhood and that maybe it was Freddie. Now, it's unknown if Freddie actually was the subject of that second rumor, but it was enough for Faust and the police to go collect DNA samples from every young man on the block, and wouldn't you know it, Freddie's DNA came back as a match. Freddie Royval was arrested in January of 1997, a little over a year after Bonnie's murder. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.